Chapter 13:13. Huang Qing believed that with Su Fengyan's strength, it would not be difficult for him to break through a thunderbolt, but he definitely did not believe that Su Fengyan could take the punishment on behalf of others. This was just like in the imperial court, when the Beimeng Empress wanted someone to die in anger. Even if you were Tuoba Bodhisattva with unparalleled martial arts and outstanding military achievements, you could not stop the Empress's decision. This had nothing to do with the level of cultivation. The cycle of heaven had its own rules. However, Huang Qing had no choice but to believe the scene in front of him. This was really beyond the imagination of Beimeng's sword aura. After the Bronze Man Grandmaster brought out his majestic Heavenly King Dharma body, his Dharma body was towering, overlooking all living things. His head was level with the black clouds, while his body walked near Huang Qing. The knife in his chest pierced through his body, but there was no blood flowing. This deeply hidden banished immortal calmly explained, "This person predicted that Su Longxiang would definitely have a day when he would break through the realm, so he had already foreshadowed it. However, I don't know what kind of secret technique he used to transfer Su Longxiang's fate to himself. This kind of technique is reversed and will only attract more punishment from heaven." Huang Qing was enlightened and sighed. Most likely it was the red armor that saw the light of day again. Otherwise, with Su Longxiang's physique, if he added an armor to increase his battle power, it would be no different from drawing legs on a snake. Originally, I thought it was the Yen Shang supernatural power of the Taoist ancestral court Longhu Mountain, which was used to suppress Su Longxiang's advancement. Now it seems that I still underestimated Su Fengyan's scheming. Huang Qing had previously heard that Wudong Mountain's ancestor Lu had the cup emptying the sea technique. If I'm not wrong, that armor is the cup to transfer Su Longxiang's fate. The Bronze Man Grandmaster, whose aura had skyrocketed, thought for a moment and nodded, "Most likely." This Grandmaster did not expect that the young man would attack with a knife in his left hand, directly knocking him into this battlefield. This knife was not sloppy, and was mixed with a mysterious technique similar to a nameless Taoist who suppressed the demon Lu Songtao 100 years ago. Even the Bronze Man Grandmaster could only retreat again and again, powerless to resist. If Su Fengyan did not choose to take the initiative to draw the knife instead of killing, he might not even be able to summon the Heavenly King Dharma body and summon and die. In the vision of the Bronze Man Grandmaster, that Su Longxiang finally ascended to the celestial realm, with the evil dragon's aura of his whole body, Huang Qing might not be a match. His Dhamma might not be able to subdue him. Grandmaster Copperman said indifferently, "Huang Qing, you withdraw for the time being. The heavenly tribulation is about to descend. There's no need for us to be dragged down and destroyed together." Huang Qing said to Huang, of course he Huang's twos. And Huang to say he. How could he not know whether or not the crazed Su Longxiang could withstand the heavenly tribulation? But if Su Longxiang wanted to free up his hands, it would be more than enough to make Huang Qing suffer. Huang Qing lowered his head to look at the famed sword, calmed the storm, and spat out a mouthful of turbid air. A determined smile appeared on his face as he looked forward, clenching his sword and taking a step forward. Sailing against the current, if you don't advance, you will fall back. Perhaps today is the opportunity for Huang Qing to step into the sword immortal realm. The Bronze Man Grandmaster said softly, "My intuition tells me that today's matter will be full of twists and turns. It's good that you don't retreat. Help me keep an eye on those two brothers. I want to add some boiling water to the furnace above my head, completely cutting off Su Longxiang's chance of survival." As the Bronze Man Grandmaster beside Huang Qing slowly raised his hand, the Heavenly King Dharma body that stood tall also raised its arms. It suddenly put its palms together, exploding out rings of golden ripples, lingering in the air. Something seemed to be born in the palm of its hand. Huang Qing held his sword in front of him and began to accumulate power. Another strange scene appeared in the distance. The red threads of Su Fengyan's arm that was pressing on Su Longxiang's head swayed, like thousands of slender red snakes spitting out their tongues, crazily absorbing Su Longxiang's 7 to 8 black flood dragons. Those red threads were once Catman Han Diaoxi's trump card to kill the heavenly phenomenon with a mysterious finger. Now, Su Fengyan was using it to steal his younger brother's heavenly phenomenon realm. The heavenly thunder was like a huge rock rolling through the black silk-like clouds, its momentum even stronger. The thunder rumbled, purple lightning intertwined, and the clouds in the sky seemed to have countless heavenly court immortals shouting angrily. When an ordinary man was angry, blood would splatter 5 steps away. When the Son of Heaven was angry, millions of corpses would fall. So what if the immortals above the 9 heavens were angry? Su Fengnian retracted his hand and gently pushed the immobile Su Longxiang, pushing his younger brother Huang Man, several miles away. Su Fengnian looked at the sky. The purple lightning swam through the clouds, like flood dragons crossing the sea. Su Fengnian held the Bailiang saber in his hand, looked up at the sky, smiled for no reason, and said to himself, Su Xiao, don't you think that scene looks like a dragon robe? For the first time, Huang Qing was in awe of one person. It was rumored that Wang Xianji once had the ambition to be the enemy of the world. His grandmaster's bearing far surpassed the other 9 people in the martial arts evaluation. And at this moment, Su Fengnian, facing the heavenly tribulation alone, also had the spirit of a hidden enemy nation. Huang Qing closed his eyes. The memories of his life from when he held and practiced the sword flashed through his mind. This sword chi immortal state of mind was damaged after his rule sword failed to achieve anything, which was equivalent to him failing to achieve anything. But after seeing Su Fengnian standing with his saber, he took the opportunity to touch the threshold of the earth immortal. His shaky realm actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise, steadily climbing up. Huang Qing opened his eyes, his expression solemn. Just wait for me, Huang Qing, to comprehend a new sword by watching the lightning fall. Then I'll use my newly comprehended sword immortal to toast you, King of Bailiang. Lightning and thunder roared, as if a hole had exploded in the sky. The second purple lightning fell with a loud bang. It did not fall directly on Su Fengnian's head, but landed dozens of meters in front of the young king of Bailiang, then turned and shot toward him. Its momentum was like the charge of 10,000 iron cavalry. Su Fengnian slightly squatted, 2 fingers of his right hand closed together, and the tip of the saber in his left hand pointed directly at the purple lightning. Su Fengnian said in a low voice, "River breaking." The purple lightning crashed toward him like a monstrous flood, and Su Fengnian cut it with his saber. The purple tide split into 2, rushing past Su Fengnian on the left and right, and quickly dissipated between heaven and earth. There seemed to be an immortal in the sky who angrily rebuked, "How dare an ordinary person defy the heavenly Tao?" Then, a third, even thicker, rolling thunder hurriedly descended to the mortal world. Su Fengnian stabbed the cold saber into the ground beside him, building up his momentum. He stepped out, raised his hands, and drew a semicircle. Shaking Kunlun with a raise of hand, he forcibly lifted the purple lightning with a palm. The sky, clouds and purple lightning stepped down together, and the earth stepped down as well. Su Fengnian stood at the bottom of a pit that was dozens of feet deep. In Huang Qing's eyes, the purple lightning dazzled and exploded, scattering on the ground like a broken water tank. When Su Fengnian picked up the Bailiang saber again and walked out of the huge pit. After the fourth, incomparably magnificent purple lightning broke through the bottom layer of the sea of clouds, it suddenly sputtered into millions of purple lightning bolts no thicker than an arm, chaotically stabbing towards Su Fengnian. The net of heaven has a long arm. Enemies on all sides. Thunder in all directions. Compared to the latter half of Huang Qing's, using rules to make a square and circle sword, it was more than just a level better. Many purple lightning bolts quickly drilled into the ground, and then quickly and violently exploded, encircling and closing in on Su Fengnian inch by inch. It could really be said to be turning heaven and earth upside down. Su Fengnian silently chanted, 6,000 li. At the crucial moment when Su Fengnian was facing off against the fourth heavenly lightning, the 100 feet Dharmakaya behind the Bronze Man Grandmaster suddenly opened up with his palms joined together. A lively painting scroll appeared in the palms of his hands. There was a Buddha meditating and chanting sutras, and a mischievous stone nodded. There was a Taoist sitting and discussing the Tao, and a heavenly maiden scattering flowers. There was a scholar holding a book in his hand, and a stone tablet in the east. There was a sword immortal riding chi in the air, playing the sword and singing. There was a divine general riding a horse holding a spear, and his golden armor was resplendent. Although Huang Qing knew that the Bronze Man Grandmaster was a banished immortal, he did not know that this Grandmaster was actually the immortal who had once guarded the gate for the heavenly Tao. The people in the painting were clearly people who had attained the Tao and ascended hundreds of years ago. At this moment, the black tiger that had been anxiously circling away from the battlefield suddenly squatted down. There was a middle-aged Taoist with an elegant appearance standing beside the black tiger with his hands behind his back, looking at the Bronze Man Grandmaster's Dharmakaya with a faint smile. In the 800 years of the world, no one was more immortal than him. Chapter 13:14. Huang Qing tried to comprehend the Earth Fairy sword by observing the thunder, but this strange Taoist appeared out of nowhere and stopped the process of comprehension. What was even stranger was that even though the comprehension was interrupted, it did not hinder the advancement of the realm at all. Even the speed of the sword intent reaching perfection did not decrease but instead increased. The Taoist crown on the Taoist's head was clearly the Wudong Taoist's Xiaoyao turban, but he wore the Taoist robe of Mount Longhu and a pair of plain hemp shoes. Without moving his feet, he suddenly appeared beside Huang Qing and stood side by side. However, the sword aura was close to Su Fengnian while the Taoist faced the Copperman Grandmaster. Huang Qing's heart gave birth to a contradictory thought that even he felt was ridiculous. It was extremely unlikely, but the most likely. This uninvited guest was the immortal who once sat on the demon-slaying platform for 60 years, Qi Xuanzhen. He was not the most powerful person in the world, but he was more powerful than the most powerful person in the world. When Huang Qing was young, he met Beimang's grand preceptor Yuan Qingshan by chance. He listened to the secrets of Taoism and commented on the level of the Taoist masters. He said that most of the so-called immortals were just Taoists who left home. Only Wudong's sect leader Wang Zhongluo and Mount Longhu's Taoist masters were considered Taoists who lived in the mountains. Although they were in the world, they were free from worldly disturbances and could add spirituality to the mountains and bring blessings to the orthodoxy. Above the two, Mount Longhu had a Taoist named Zhao who lived in seclusion. He stole heaven's secrets and raised an evil dragon. He could be considered a secluded Taoist. For thousands of years, there were many immortals who ascended. Yuan Qingshan only respected two seniors. One was an immortal Taoist who was born several times, and the other was a true Taoist who cultivated to become an immortal but returned from Heaven's Gate, Lu Dongxian. No one doubted that Qi Xuanzhen was the reincarnation of Lu Dongxian. Huang Qing also received confirmation from Qilin's grand preceptor. As for whether the previous martial arts sect leader Hong Shixiang was also the reincarnation of Lu Dongxian, Huang Qing and Yuan Qingshan did not meet again after that time. As for why Qi Xianshu would appear at this time and place, Huang Qing had some bold guesses. If the rumor that Ancestor Lu had passed through the gate of heaven and returned to the world was true, then it was reasonable for Ancestor Copperman, the immortal guarding the gate of heaven, to be reduced to a banished immortal. Huang Qing felt somewhat powerless. If Qi Xuanzhen were to make a move, even if he could deliver that sword strike, even if Grandmaster Copperman could completely spread out that magnificent picture scroll, would they still be able to succeed? Qi Xuanzhen spoke. There was no sound between heaven and earth, but Huang Qing heard every word. Huang Qing, I am a swordsman. Since we have 3 feet of green swords in our hands, how can we bend our backs to serve the powerful? Hearing good words is like gifting gold. Hearing heavy words is like carrying a mountain. Huang Qing could not help but bend his back slightly, and a bitter expression appeared on his face. Beimang had been taken in as a favored concubine by His Majesty in Jianghu, and had become a force to be reckoned with in the Central Plains. This was the general trend. How could the sword chi of his chess and sword music school contend against it? More importantly, the first time Huang Qing held a sword was in the chess and sword music school. He was greatly indebted to the peace order. Huang Qing slowly straightened his back and calmly said, Zhenren Qi, there are things that I, Huang Qing, can't do, but there are things that I can do. Qi Xuanzhen sighed and seemed to be somewhat regretful. In the end, he did not stop Huang Qing from continuing to nurture that sword strike. Grandmaster Copperman stood at the foot of the Heavenly King's Dharmakaya and angrily shouted, Qi Xuanzhen, you are just a wisp of remnant breath. How can you stop me? The burly old man pretended to be angry, and the Dharmakaya also had the Heavenly King's beard and angry eyes. Qi Xuanzhen ignored Grandmaster Copperman's threat, and only raised his head to look at the long scroll of celestial beings. The scroll formed a big circle above everyone's head. On this big circle, there were all those amazing people who had attained Tao and ascended to the Heavenly Gate 700 years ago. Regardless of whether they were from different religions and schools, they were all once the most influential figures in the world. Although they were only the illusions and incarnations of the gods' favored ones, they were able to frighten the land immortals. It was hard to say whether this was unprecedented, but it was destined to be unparalleled in the future. The sky that was originally covered with dark clouds was like adding fuel to the bottom of a cauldron. The boiling water boiled even more, and the several purple thunderbolts that had not yet fallen became more vigorous and thick. Even the purple thunderbolt that had already taken root on the ground suddenly skyrocketed several times. Su Fengnian's 6,000 miles, which had already broken through most of the purple thunderbolts, showed signs of danger that it would be difficult to continue. To attain Tao and immortality, Every time a thunderbolt fell from the sky, the people on the ground would only have one breath. There was absolutely no possibility of breathing new life. The magnificent sword aura that was produced by the 6,000-mile sword move had previously stretched out and was imposing. It had already cut through 60 to 70% of the blooming purple thunderbolts in one go. However, after the Grandmaster Copperman's 100 feet Heavenly King Dharma body stirred up the situation, the heaven and earth changed. The furnace boiled and the purple thunderbolts on the ground collided with each other, creating countless lightning sparks that shrouded Su Fengnian. One could only vaguely see that the sword aura that was originally as magnificent as the Guangling River had shrunk into a small stream, flowing around Su Fengnian to resist the purple thunderbolts. The Grandmaster Copperman's voice was as loud as a bell. He sneered and said, "Qi Xuanzhen, could it be that you're just bluffing? Why don't you lend a hand to save him?" He took a step forward and his voice became louder. "Qi Xuanzhen, are you unable or do you not dare?" Qi Xuanzhen's long sleeves fluttered in the wind, and the hair on his temples fluttered gently with the wind. The great spiritual master smiled and said, "You want to ruin my Tao heart with just a gatekeeper?" Qi Xuanzhen turned to look at the place where the purple thunderbolts covered the sky and shook his head. "It's only the fourth thunderbolt. Even if you're interfering, there's no need for me to do anything." They had traveled 6,000 miles in the Jianghu together. The journey was long and the Guangling River was long. However, there was a stream outside Liangzhou city that circled around the city. It was small and close. There was once an old man who lacked front teeth and loved drinking yellow wine. He led a horse across the river and never returned home. Surrounded by the thunderbolts, a person laughed loudly and said, "Old Huang, the wind is urgent. Don't pull." The fourth heavenly thunder collapsed in an instant. However, the fifth thunderbolt, which was turning darker and darker in color, fell instantly. Su Fengnian stretched out his hands. The Overlord carries the cauldron. Purple gas poured out crazily, leaking from his fingers and flowing violently to his head and shoulders. Qi Xuanzhen retracted his gaze and restrained his smile. Immortals use the earth as a chessboard, a mountain, a city, and a country as chess pieces, and the fate of the world as the arm that holds the chess pieces. They wantonly place their chess pieces and decide the life and death of mortals as they wish. In my opinion, this is against the great Tao. Against the great Tao. After Qi Xuanzhen said those words, the immortal scroll of the Heavenly King's Dharma form produced a slight tearing sound. Then, it became more and more intense. The scroll shattered bit by bit, and the immortal incarnations on the painting dissipated one by one. Even a crack appeared between the eyebrows of the Heavenly King's Dharma form, and golden light shot out in all directions. A bloody scar appeared on the forehead of Grandmaster Copperman, and golden blood flowed all over his face. Qi Xuanzhen said coldly, "Today, I'm here to end the feud between you and me in the Heavenly Gate. You won't listen to reason." The great spiritual master put one hand behind his back and pointed with one finger. Grandmaster Copperman's chest seemed to have been struck by lightning. He flew backward and collided with the Dharma body. The 1,000 feet tall Dharma body also fell on its back. Qi Xuanzhen waved his other hand, and Grandmaster Copperman was suddenly lifted up. Then, he threw him in a direction thousands of miles away. Qi Xuanzhen didn't even look at Grandmaster Copperman, who landed on the Guangling Road in a flash. He sneered and said, "Since you won't listen to my advice, then get lost." Huang Qing, who only wanted to stay still, suddenly moved. He suddenly drew his sword and began to sprint with his sword. He charged straight at Su Fengnian, who was suppressed by the purple lightning. The power of his sword was no less than a bolt of heavenly lightning. Qi Xuanzhen didn't stop him. He only sighed. On the way forward, a figure blocked the path of the man and the sword. The newcomer let the sword pass through his chest and punched Huang Qing's head. Huang Qing died on the spot. The corpse with the sword out of his hand fell heavily in the distance. The corpse was bleeding from all 7 orifices. However, this person was determined to use the sword in his hand to suppress the sword qi of Liang Zhonghu since he was young. There was no regret or sorrow on his face. The youth with the sword in his chest let out a roar towards the sky. Qi Xuanzhen looked at the youth who he should have called brother-in-law in his other life. His eyes were somewhat guilty. He said softly, "The road leads to the sky. Let's go our separate ways. Li Yufu, I'm not as good as you." Just as Huang Qing said, there were things people could do and things they couldn't do in the world. Moreover, Qi Xuanzhen was a cultivator in both life and death. Everyone had their own path. Qi Xuanzhen could move away some of the obstacles blocking the path, but he couldn't walk it for others. Qi Xuanzhen's body was like a cloud fading and the wind blowing. In the end, he turned into ashes. The youth with no pupils and a stiff expression unexpectedly squeezed out a smile for no reason. He looked at the middle-aged Taoist who he had met on the demon execution platform. "Brother-in-law, have a safe journey." Qi Xuanzhen smiled knowingly and nodded. A vigorous aura originated from somewhere in the western capital of the southern dynasty. It came from the north to the south and stirred up the situation again. Qi Xuanzhen was furious. Before it dissipated, he pressed down with one hand. The hibernation vat in the western capital building suddenly exploded. The building was filled with water. A dragon came out of the water. Qi Xuanzhen, who was about to completely dissipate, had a worried expression. He said regretfully, "For the matter of Zhanlong, there will be a time when my strength will be exhausted." Huang Manor grinned and twisted his neck. The youth who had no strength in his hands pulled out the sword self-taught. He used qi to control the sword and pulled out the calm disturbance. He threw the sword high and then used his mouth to bite the sword hilt. Unknowingly, although it was ridiculous, it was still a form of horizontal sword. The youth first looked at his brother in the distance, and finally looked back at Qi Xuanzhen. His eyes seemed to say to Qi Xuanzhen that he was here, so he could go without worry. After Qi Xuanzhen nodded, he looked at the sky. Before he completely disappeared, he seemed to ask the heavens, "Mortals are mortal and live forever. If it is said that mortals suffer because of love, what joy is there in living forever without love?" Su Longxiang began to run towards the north. He lowered his head, bent his waist, bit the sword, and held the sword horizontally. Chapter 13:15. In the southern part of Chuan, the bamboo sea was blue and the sky was blue. It was late at night, but there was no snow. A group of people strolled in the sea like immortals. A man in white with a jade-like face was dressed in white. However, compared to the traveling scholars in the bamboo sea, he had an indescribable aura of the battlefield. The other man, who was slightly older, had a scholarly aura. He was more in line with the style of a pure scholar. Behind the two of them was a graceful woman. She was the prettiest in Chuan. She was dressed in white with large sleeves. Even her embroidered shoes were white with only light green lotus flowers embroidered on them. It was as if she was deliberately matching the clothes of the man in front of her. She held a slender bamboo branch in her hand. The two people in front of her walked leisurely but not slowly. This made her feel a little powerless. She was slightly panting, but she did not dare to suggest taking a break. She knew that whether it was climbing the mountain or following in the smoke in the future, as long as she stopped, she would never be able to catch up with the stalwart man in front of her. Even if she was Xia, the charming woman who won the Rouge Review consecutively and the mistress of the top sect in Shishu. She could not help but look up at the middle-aged scholar beside the man she admired. Her eyes were filled with sincere respect. She and the latter had the same surname. However, she was from an insignificant side branch of the Xia family. He was from the main branch of the Xia family, one of the top 10 clans in the Central Plains. The Xia family was unfortunately the first to fall in the Spring and Autumn War. At that time, the eldest grandson of the Xia family was called Xie Guanying. He was known as the Heavenly Talent. He was skilled in both literature and martial arts. He joined forces with Li Yishan across the river to review the Rouge Review. However, as the cavalry of the Su family continued to go south, Xie Guanying suddenly disappeared. The Xie family, who had lost its mainstay in a life-and-death situation, died out. After Xie Guanying, the two new martial arts review sessions were fortunately able to continue. However, the Rouge Review was a failure and could not convince the public. Soon, no one dared to take over. Later, even Su Weisheng of the Shangyin Academy retreated and gave up the idea. Xie Guanying was just one of the many chess pieces that the Xie family hurriedly placed on the chessboard when they were in trouble. When this man from the Xie clan, who had disappeared for 20 years, appeared in Western Shu and assisted Chen Jibao, who was the vassal of Western Shu, Xie felt as if he had fallen into the clouds. The three of them ascended the stairs, the mountain's topography swirled around, the cliffs were as sharp as swords. When they arrived at the top of the mountain, they gazed into the distance at the Locking Dragon Cliff, a panoramic view of the Sea of Bamboo. "Thank you, as the master of the Bamboo Sea, for introducing the story of Sualong Cliff to the two of them." Pointing at the cliff carvings he continued, Legend has it that in ancient times, an ancestral dragon was buried in Shishu, and this dragon's claws, eyes, and pearls were all stripped away by the immortals using great supernatural powers. The dragon pearl in its mouth was embedded in this wall. From then on, Shishu's draconic chi was only enough to transform into a flood dragon, not a dragon. Throughout history, there were only flood dragons and no dragons. In history, there was once a martial artist who divided Shishu and tried to break open Sua Long Cliff, but he soon died suddenly for no reason. For hundreds of years, famous figures of the three sects of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism all liked to inscribe on this wall, each with their own merits. The immortal cultivation platform that occupies the most central piece of Feng Shui treasured land was inscribed by the great Feng dynasty's Chao Sheng. At the top, the 7 semi-cursive characters were carved by the Taoist saint, Lu An with his sword. The smallest characters among the cliff carvings were facing the heart and facing the Buddha, carved by a nameless monk. Strangely, the character heart and heart was the smallest. Later, a Confucian grandmaster, Wang Yuanshan, climbed the mountain on a snowy night and looked at the characters with a candle. When he was in the mood, he took out his sword and chiseled a little bit. This is the origin of today's Wang Yuanshan painted the dragon's eye on a snowy night, comprehended the Tao and became a saint by looking at the characters. Since then, he had entered the realm of Confucian sage and transcended the mortal world. The middle-aged scholar looked at the cliff carvings of famous scholars that covered the mountain wall, as if he was looking at the face of an old man. Man and mountain, guest and host, both were silent. Xie walked to the side of the man in white and asked softly, "General, are there really flood dragons in the world?" King of Shu Chen Jibao said indifferently, "If you see it, then it is. If you don't see it, then it is not." Xie was stunned for a moment. If it was a normal person who said such nonsense, she would definitely take it as a pretentious pretense. But how could the villain too, who had always been a man of few words, be so bored? The middle-aged scholar called Xie Feiyu by the sect master of the Guanyin sect smiled and said, "Actually, it's not just West Shu that has no dragons. There are also Nanjiao to the south of West Shu, Nanjiang where Zhao Bing, the prince of Yanqi, is at, and the Tu Liao ruled by Zhao Sui, the prince of Jiaodong. But flood dragons are everywhere, so it's not surprising." Zhao Huangchao of Dragon Tiger Mountain stole the fate of West Shu and used the #1 blessed land of Taoism, Earth Lung Mountain, as a cave to raise a black dragon. Beimeng absorbed the fate that Hong Jia brought to the north and successfully raised a flood dragon somewhere in Xijing. Xie Feiyu suddenly laughed. Zhao Bing and Nailan Yusi of Nanjiang have been racking their brains over the matter of the dragon and have been playing little tricks. Great Peace City has turned a blind eye to it. Su Shao and Li Yishan of Beiliang are too lazy to care about the illusory fate. Instead, they are viewed as a great threat by the imperial court. Xie, can you guess the reason behind this? Xie shook her head. Xie Feiyu turned and glanced at the white-robed Chen Jibao. His tone was playful. 20 years ago, Huang Longsher was the instigator of the prophecy of White Python prospering Qin that was widely spread in Great Peace City. I also added fuel to the fire. At the time, the imperial astronomer quickly found evidence from the dusty ancient records. The black dragon of Earth Lung Mountain came because of this. As for the white python robe that the imperial court gave to Su Fengnian, it was also made by me. Speaking of which, no matter how much everyone, including me, played around with the prophecy, it was just copying the wisdom of others. It is not even worthy of carrying shoes for that Huang Sonjia. Saying this, Xie Feiyu suddenly looked to the north. He narrowed his eyes and made a sound of surprise. His left hand shrunk into his sleeve and quickly calculated. Chen Jibao looked to the north almost at the same time. Only the ignorant Xie was left. She had heard that after entering celestial phenomenon, one would have a chance of attaining the mysterious heaven's perception. Xie had a deep understanding of the 4 realms of first rank. Celestial phenomenon was a threshold. The difference between celestial phenomenon and finger profound was only second to the difference between first and second ranks. The first grade of Taoism enlightened being was the finger mystic. Many talented Qi watchers, such as Mei Yingyi from the Guanyin sect, could also comprehend the finger sword. Many martial artists in the first grade of Vajra realm had 1 or 2 finger mystic secret techniques as their trump card. Celestial phenomenon was much rarer than finger profound. After entering finger profound, it was rare to be able to go further. However, if one entered celestial phenomenon and became an earth immortal, It was a matter of pushing the boat with the current. Xie Feiyu kept calculating with his fingers in his sleeve. He said softly, "Before celestial phenomenon, the depth of qi in a martial artist's body is like a well or a pond. Each has its own depth, but it is still a stagnant water. Once a battle of life and death occurs, the water in the well or the pond will be reduced by a fraction. Then, once one enters celestial phenomenon, it will be like the spring god lake, connected to the river. It will be a living water with a source. However, once there is a rainstorm, the river will flood and the lake will be implicated. Celestial phenomenon has its advantages and disadvantages. After resonating with heaven and earth, it is like handing over a travel permit to God. The saints of the three sects don't dare to kill because the rules are the most important in the three sections. As the saying goes, heaven's law is clear. They don't dare to cross the line." Qin Zhibao asked, "Has Bei Mang made a move?" Xie Feiyu nodded and said, "It is indeed a big movement." What followed was a long silence, and the middle-aged scholar occasionally spoke. Even if he spoke, his words were concise and comprehensive, making it hard to understand. Xie Feiyu heard about sword aura, banished deity, 7 thunders become 8 thunders, Qi Xianzhu, dragon tiger purple golden lotus, hibernation vat, and so on. During this period, Xie Feiyu noticed that Chen Jibao's gaze shifted from the west to the east, as if he was admiring a shooting star across the sky. However, she followed his line of sight and saw nothing. As the twilight deepened, Xie Feiyu couldn't hide his fatigue. However, he soon became energetic. He stretched out his left hand and flicked his 5 fingers. He said decisively, "Great things can be expected." Xie Feiyu looked at the sky and stretched out his arms. He muttered, "There are layers of sieves between heaven and earth. It is easy to go up but hard to go down. The banished deity is a fish that slipped through the net. He is also the bait that the celestial being deliberately left behind. The Xie family retreats in order to advance. I, Xie Feiyu, have retreated again and again. Chen Zhibao, I helped you absorb the Buddhist fate of the dragon tree monk to make up for your loss of leaving Bailiang. Previously, I even helped Zhao Huangchao raise the dragon Earthlung mountain, and let you enter the capital as the minister of war in exchange for the fate of Taoism that he accumulated. Once Chao Zhongqing dies, you will be able to merge the 3 sects into one." Xie Feiyu's face was pale. She lowered her head and didn't even dare to breathe. Chen Zhibao was expressionless. Xie Feiyu retracted his hands into his sleeves and said self-mockingly, "The saint once said that those who can live long in heaven and earth can live forever because they do not give birth to themselves." Chen Zhibao frowned. "Who said that there are flood dragons in Western Shu but no dragons?" Xie Feiyu turned around and faced the cliff that was said to be locking the dragon. He shook his sleeves and a white bowl appeared in front of him. There were small flood dragons swimming in the bowl like fish. The flood dragons jumped out of the bowl like flying fish. They swam towards the cliff and hid within. Xie Feiyu laughed. "Qi Xuanzhen has broken the hibernation vat. The battle between the dragon and python is imminent. After tonight, the hidden dragon of southern border will still be difficult to achieve, but there is a true dragon in Western Shu. This is the last chapter for today. The next chapter, Dragon Slaying, is really difficult to write." Chapter 13:16. The woman was sitting on a sand dune. Her sitting posture was as casual as the bold men at the border. She was so tall that she looked majestic even when she was sitting. She witnessed the spectacular scene of someone fighting against the purple thunder of heaven's tribulation by himself. Even though she was the world's top chi cultivator guru, she was still shaken. After she followed the man here, she saw the heavenly king Dharma form of the bronze man grandmaster, Huang Qing's sword Qi, and Qi Xuanzhen's appearance and eventual disappearance. Regarding the appearance of Qi Xuanzhen, she was more aware than anyone else in the world. For cultivators, the word karma was like the common people who were plagued with diseases, which could be cured easily. If Qi Xuanzhen or ancestor Lu wanted to continue his cultivation without hindrance, he must have a result, which was to completely settle his grievances with the ancestor Copperman, who was a banished immortal. As for why Qi Xuanzhen, who was born from one Qi, through the ancestor Copperman into Guangling's sect, she guessed that it had something to do with Huang Sanjia. If Huang Sanjia could make up for his mistakes, he might be able to return to heaven. Huang Qing's death at the hands of Su Longxiang, who had brazenly ascended, was unexpected, but within reason. In her opinion, Wang Xianji, who had suppressed the Jianghu for 60 years, was an old man with an unreasonable fist. However, Su Longxiang's talent was not inferior in any way. In fact, Su Longxiang was even more unreasonable than the one in the distance. Even if Huang Qing's aptitude, temperament, and strength were among the top martial artists, it was still too early for him to meet Su Longxiang, who was willing to sacrifice himself to attract the heavenly thunder. It would be more likely for him to become a real sword fairy. Due to Qi Xuanzhen's interference, the situation did not favor Bei Meng. However, it was still difficult to stop the collapse of the Great Tower. The woman in white had a complicated expression. She grabbed 2 handfuls of sand. She hesitated whether she should take action or not. Tantai Pingjing and the 6-jewel bodhisattva of Mount Lantua were now considered to have boarded Bailiang's pirate ship. They each had their own secret desires. The latter hoped to unify the western regions with the help of the Bailiang cavalry, and even to spread their teachings to the Central Plains without hindrance in the future. Compared to the female Dharmaraja, the Guanyin sect was not so utilitarian. Tantai Pingjing's original intention was nothing more than to mend the sky. The ancestors of the sect had once passed down the 4 words of a prophecy: the sky tilted to the northwest. Later, after her master's painstaking research, she reached the realm of a celestial being. However, she only came up with a vague conclusion that the sky in the northwest broke open and qi flowed backwards into the earth, just like the sea flowed backwards into the rivers. Tantai Pingjing could only take 1 step at a time. If Bailiang was really the main culprit, then the Guanyin sect, as the current ally of Bailiang, would have no choice but to change sides. However, Tantai Pingjing had never been honest with that person about this secret hidden deep in her heart. It was not that he was unwilling, but that he could not. Tantai Pingjing looked into the distance. The 5th heavenly thunder was about to fall. That person had quickly taken a breath of fresh air and was ready to strike. Before this, he had tried to stop Su Longxiang from heading north. However, he was quickly targeted by the heavenly thunder above his head. He had no time to care about anything else and could not do anything else. There were many helpless things in the world. Undoubtedly, it was not that he was unwilling, but that he could not do anything. Even if he had withstood 4 heavenly thunders, he was no exception. Their hearts were linked and they understood at once. Tantai Pingjing did not receive any reminder, but she already knew what he was thinking. She sighed and no longer hesitated. She raised her arms and her sleeves were like wings. She pressed her fists together and slowly pulled them apart. Yellow sand sprinkled from between her fingers. The yellow sand sprinkled down, each grain distinct and hovering in the air. The waterfall fell from the sky. Its spray was like pearls, its flow was like silk, and its sound was like a zither. The mysterious scene that appeared in front of her was like a work of God. After all, it only happened in a short distance. It was not spectacular, but it was definitely shocking. The Guanyin sect had 2 secret treasures that allowed this sect to suppress the qi cultivators of the supporting dragon sect in the north. One of them was the land pilgrimage map that almost caused Su Fengnian to fail miserably. The other was the Moon Well heavenly mirror that was becoming more and more unknown. Both of them targeted the Yu Xiaobel spirit between heaven and earth, making it difficult for it to cross the heavenly thunderpool and binding it within the rules. The latter appeared for the first time in hundreds of years. Coincidentally, not long ago, Tantai Pingjing tested Su Longxiang. However, at that time, the Moon Well heavenly mirror was formed by 2 green water droplets falling down in 2 arcs. It was also at that time that someone went against common sense and passed through the Moon Well heavenly mirror. It was like breaking the moon on the sea, causing ripples in the heart of the great master Tantai, who had cultivated Taoism for almost 100 years. Literature seemed to be happy to see the mountains unequal. However, cultivation was the exact opposite. It was most afraid of ups and downs in one's Taoist heart. Tantai Pingjing wanted to calm down the ripples, and even more so, her Taoist heart. This time, she made an exception to help him. She would treat it as repaying the favor of guiding her in her previous life. After that, no matter how the Battle of Liangmang went, she would not owe him anything. She would do everything according to the rules. Tantai Pingjing sat upright. In front of her was the still waterfall made of yellow sand. To be precise, it was another form of the Moon Well heavenly mirror. Her arms suddenly pulled outwards. The heavenly mirror suddenly enlarged and stood upright in front of her. Tantai Pingjing stretched out a finger and gently pushed the mirror surface. The mirror moved horizontally and then disappeared in a flash. More than 300 miles away in the north, the moon-well heavenly mirror that had expanded countless times slowly appeared. To the south of the mirror, Su Longxiang was running with a sword in his mouth with his head lowered. To the north of the mirror, a huge monster appeared angrily after the hibernating vat was broken by Qi Xian. The young man and the huge monster that should only be embroidered on the dragon robe and python costume should have collided at the place where the mirror appeared. Then there would be an earth-shaking fight. The huge monster came with clouds and rain. Occasionally, a ferocious head, flying long beard, and a pair of golden eyes could be seen in the clouds and mist. When it sensed the aura of the heavenly mirror in front of it, its huge golden eyes showed a trace of human-like sarcasm. After a short pause, it rushed out of the clouds and rain and hit the mirror directly. Su Fengnian, who had his back to Tan Tai Ping Jing, was relieved. He did not turn around but nodded gently. This subtle action was already the greatest gratitude to this Qi trainer guru for doing her best. Tan Tai Ping Jing looked at the lonely back with purple thunder hanging over his head. Tears blurred her eyes for no reason. There was once a man with white hair standing by the Guangling River. He said that in this life and the next life, he would like to know all the good people in the world, read all the good books in the world, and see all the good mountains and rivers in the world. No matter how good the scenery in the sky was, he would never envy it. After Tan Tai Ping Jing mobilized so many people to take out the important weapon of the sect, she looked a little dejected and sat on the sand dune in a daze. For Su Fengnian, who was fighting against the heaven's punishment, this was definitely not a measure of timely help. It was one disaster after another. Chapter 13:17. There was a saying in the world that a big python in the mountain would become a flood dragon after entering the river. Finally, it would come to the door and become a dragon. In the 9 kingdoms of spring and autumn, the flames of war were everywhere. Except for West Shu, which had locked up the real dragon since ancient times, the 8 kingdoms each had a real dragon hidden by fate. As the Zhao family of Liang unified the Central Plains, Beimang, which originally had a flood dragon without a dragon, took the opportunity to raise a real dragon in order to enter the Central Plains and seize the world. Zhao Huangchao, who was stubborn, was also lucky enough to raise a black dragon in the Earthlung Mountain. He even set up a sinister plot in the Bailiang Inn in order to swallow the fate of West Chu and harm the Su family of Bailiang. Now Xie Feiyu followed Chen Jibao into Shu to catch a flood dragon and raise a dragon to help Chen Jibao become a saint. Once he succeeded, not to mention that the fate of Shu would skyrocket, Chen Jibao alone would be enough to compete with Su Fengnian, the so-called #1 person in the world, and even have a greater chance of winning. There were 3 real dragons in the world, and the target was actually the man in front of her in the end. Especially the one from Beimang, who was about to descend here. Tantai calmly looked at the back and asked softly, "Don't you think you are pitiful?" She took a deep breath and stood up. Finally, her heart was as still as water again. She no longer looked at the man who was destined to die, and turned to walk down the hill. Su Fengnian successively used Li Chuangong's one-sleeve green snake, Wudong's old chief Wang Zhongluo's 2 fingers breaking the river, Beimeng's shaking the Kunlun with the rising hand, and Old Huang's 9,000-mile sword to destroy the 4 heavenly thunders. These 4 moves were all to counter soldiers with arms and water with an earth weir. Su Fengnian looked up at the 5th heavenly thunders that were constantly accumulating purple gas and white lightning, and remained silent. If the immortals touched the top of the head, it meant that the hair was tied and the hair was tied to immortality. Then was the heavenly thunders pressing the top of the head meant that life and death were in the hands of heaven? At this moment, Su Fengnian couldn't say anything like, "Man can conquer the heavens." He just couldn't die. This time, Su Fengnian did not passively resist the lightning. Instead, he tapped the ground with the tip of his foot, creating a huge spider web on the yellow sand. He rose from the ground and raised his palm, welcoming the heavenly lightning that had finally descended. Even if the sky were to collapse, he still had to try and see if he could hold it up with one hand. When Su Fengnian's palm came into contact with a majestic purple lightning, it was as if the tip of a needle had come into contact with a heavy hammer. The thick and solid lightning did not flow down along his palm. Instead, it condensed into a flat surface like a mirror, maintaining a falling posture as a whole. Obviously, it did not give Su Fengnian any chance to take advantage of the situation. Su Fengnian's palm was like a mortal holding up his palm to catch the rain. Thunder and lightning splashed in all directions like water droplets. It was a spectacular sight. Su Fengnian's eyes turned red. He stole a lesson from the human cat Han Diaosi. Then, red threads continuously grew, like thousands of slender red snakes swimming all over his body. The heavenly lightning did not strike Su Fengnian back to the ground. However, falling was inevitable. The purple lightning began to compress from top to bottom. Its momentum seemed to be diminishing, but the weight of the heavenly lightning did not weaken in the slightest. After half an incense stick's worth of time, Su Fengnian, with his arms trembling, was still suspended in the air. However, after the descending heavenly lightning was continuously compressed, it became a narrow surface less than 3 inches thick. Su Fengnian pursed his lips and clenched his teeth. However, blood continued to seep out from between his teeth, filling his mouth with blood. Su Fengnian exhaled the last bit of air left in his body. His slightly bent arm instantly straightened. His palm pushed up, and his body rose 1 zhang. Although the entire purple lightning mirror did not shatter, the center of the mirror was dented by him. Although Tan Tai Pingjing had already walked down the dune and was moving further and further away from Su Fengnian, she was still certain that the 5th bolt of heavenly lightning was most likely unable to suppress Su Fengnian. Only now did she realize that it was snowing. However, due to the interference of the heavenly tribulation, there was temporarily no snow. She suddenly and quickly turned her head to look. Anger, surprise, and panic intertwined. For the first time she felt regret. Unexpectedly, she directly turned back to the sand dune and looked up. The situation was extremely serious. She was the one who sent out the Moonwell sky mirror. Of course, she knew the result of the collision between Su Longxiang and the giant with scales as big as a basin. The latter did not come into contact with the teenager, but came directly to this place. Then, the latter quickly showed her, a chi cultivator, what was called unpredictable nature's design. According to the historical records, the heavenly dragon could be both dark and bright, thin and huge. There was once a heavenly dragon in the East Sea. It opened its mouth from the clouds and sucked the sea. The water was like a waterfall into the dragon's mouth. It was extremely spectacular. What Tan Tai Pingjing saw was similar to the records. After the real dragon that had been dormant in Beimang for many years passed through the mirror, its power was temporarily restrained by the Moonwell sky mirror. It was as small as a snake, floating in the air. However, when it opened its mouth, it quickly swallowed the 5th bolt of heavenly lightning that was about to be broken by Su Fengnian into its stomach. In this way, it suddenly shook its body and shook off the rules of nature, imposed on it by the sky mirror. Its body and momentum grew rapidly, and in an instant, it became 200 or 300 feet long as a small dragon. It was not in a hurry to hit Su Fengnian when he was down. Instead, it quietly crept in the air like a python whose belly swelled after a full meal, staring coldly at Su Fengnian. It seemed to be gloating at the show. The 5th bolt of heavenly lightning dissipated. However, in the sky that was covered with dark clouds, the rolling thunder was even louder. There was an additional bolt of purple lightning in the sky. 7 thunders became 8. It was more of a hindrance than a help. Tan Tai Pingjing's unintentional action was like this, and its evil intention was even more so. The heavenly thunder summoner seemed to be angry because the rules were broken. However, it did not punish the real dragon of Beimang, but Su Fengnian, who was a helper. The 6th bolt of heavenly lightning did not give Su Fengnian any chance to breathe at all. It came to the human world. This bolt of purple lightning was not as thick as a mountain. Instead, it was extremely thin. Life and death were on the line. It was really a thin line. Su Fengnian almost immediately gave up the decision to retreat. Relying on instinct, he tried to tilt his head back. However, his head barely avoided this bolt of lightning, but his abdomen could not escape. It was instantly penetrated by this bolt of purple lightning. The teenager who was connected to Su Fengnian by blood was originally looking around 300 miles away. He did not know why he could not stop the big snake. When he looked back and saw the bolt of purple lightning that connected heaven and earth, he seemed to realize something and began to run back the way he came. For some reason, the 7th bolt of lightning was much less powerful than the first 6. The sound of thunder gradually faded, and the lightning gradually faded. However, the dark clouds in the sky gradually turned purple. Tan Tai Pingjing did not hear the thunder, but her heart was beating like a drum. She was just an outsider, but she was already so embarrassed. How would that guy deal with it? In the distance, the real dragon that was getting bigger and bigger had a pair of emotionless golden eyes. Its 2 dragon whiskers were swaying leisurely. Su Fengnian fell back to the ground. The right hand that had withstood the 6th bolt of lightning was still surrounded by lightning and sizzling. He gently pressed his bleeding abdomen with his left hand, barely preventing the injury from worsening. He raised his head and looked at the sky. The emperor of the Great Qin dynasty, the Zhenwu Great Emperor, and the most powerful vassal of the Liang dynasty. His mother was gone. Su Xiao was gone. His eldest sister was gone. His second sister was in a wheelchair. She almost died back then. Guarding the northwest gate for the people of the Central Plains was the best he could do. If he couldn't do it, he wouldn't feel too guilty. But who would want to take away Su Fengnian's younger brother, Huang Man, No. At the end of his second tour of Jianghu, the old man with the sheepskin fur coat had broken 2,600 armor at the Guangling River. At that time, he had no way to reason with the king of Guangling, Zhao Yi. It was Su Xiao who did it. At that time, Su Xiao said that he was old and that Su Fengnian would have to reason with others in the future. So today, Su Fengnian would have to reason with God. The seventh bolt of lightning was faintly rotating in the sky above his head. It restrained its heavenly might and did not release it. This allowed the snowflakes that had been falling to the ground only a few miles away to drift over with the wind. The Bailiang saber stuck in the ground in the distance was not conspicuous. There was a saber in the snow. Chapter 13:18. Perhaps in the eyes of people from the Central Plains, Su Zhao's doggerel, which began with snowflakes as big as fists, was simply nonsense from the frontier barbarians. However, the snow situation between the two cities of Qingcang and Linyao did have the spirit of a snowflake as big as a banquet. Tantai Pingjing looked at the seventh heavenly thunder in the sky. It was the last pass of Su Zhao's youngest son's natal heavenly tribulation, the tribulation of dragon and elephant. However, due to the disturbance of the true dragon of Bei Mang, the extremely rare thunder above thunder was born. Tantai Pingjing did not think that Su Fengnian could withstand the seventh heavenly thunder, not to mention the unpredictable eighth heavenly thunder. The great guru also could not hide her pale face. She whispered, "When the qi opens the earth, the sound moves the sky. Master, you used to laugh at yourself for worrying too much. Now you're really going to collapse." The heavenly tribulation sounded very mysterious, but Tantai Pingjing knew its details well. It was much easier for the sages of the three sects to ascend. It was just like the officials in the imperial court. Once they obtained the noble status of the Hanlin Academy, they could easily rise to the center of the palace. There was a saying in the world that thunder, rain, and dew were all heavenly grace. For example, the father and son of Taoist master of Dragon Tiger Mountain ascended on cranes together, and the later master of nation of Bei Mang, Yuan Qingshan, ascended in the form of a rainbow. These were typical examples of more rain and dew than thunder. However, martial artists like Tuoba Bodhisattva Dong Tai were more like local officials. The route was much more complicated. At the last moment, it was inevitable that the thunder would outweigh the rain and dew. After Ancestor Lu, the person who bore the heaviest heavenly tribulation was the Taoist master with a different surname, Qi Xianzhu, who had the reputation of sitting high in the clouds on the demon-slaying platform. However, only a few people knew that Qi Xianzhu was the reincarnation of Ancestor Lu. No matter what Qi Xianzhu thought at that time, the result was that this immortal in the human world still could not withstand the sixth heavenly thunder after being struck by 5 thunders. Regretfully, he was reincarnated. Originally, the world was looking forward to how many heavenly thunder would Wang Xianji attract in Martial Emperor City. 6 or 7. It was a pity that such an old monster, who was recognized by the world as a match for Lu Dongxian, had died just like that. Now, Su Fengnian had attracted the terrifying vision of 8 thunders above his head. However, this was a once-in-a-lifetime scene. Apart from the powerless Tantai Pingjing and the true dragon who hit him when he was down, there were no other onlookers who could witness it. Behind Tantai Pingjing, a slightly teasing and mellow voice suddenly came. "This is not like you." Without turning her head, she asked, "Why are you here?" A slovenly middle-aged man came to Tantai Pingjing's side. He was dressed in coarse linen, wore worn-out boots, and had a face full of stubble. At first glance, it was obvious that he was a single man without a wife to help him tidy up. He was plain-looking and had no wine or sword. If he said that he was a paladin, he would be laughed at by Jianghu people. However, since he was able to talk to the world's top Qi refinement grandmaster, he naturally wouldn't be a nobody. A few years earlier, he and his apprentice had some style when they traveled in Jianghu. For example, they rode a donkey and carried a peach tree. It was not to pretend to be a master, but because of interest. In fact, at his level, even if he walked with a donkey or carried a peach tree on his back, No one in Jianghu dared to be disrespectful to him. In the past 800 years, Jianghu had been unique in Jianghu. There were more than 30 masters who were close to earth immortals. There were 1 or 2 sword gods in each generation of Jianghu. Most of them became the first person in the world at that time. However, only the Peach Blossom Sword God, who reached the top of Jianghu at a very young age, was regarded as another champion of Jianghu after ancestor Lu and Li Chungang. He was said to be close to Tao. Therefore the name Dong Tai could not be avoided in Jianghu for another 300 years. This middle-aged man who came from a humble background but had great achievements smiled and said, "How can I not come after making such a big fuss?" Then Dong Tai said to himself, "I can't figure out how old Monster Wong lost, but I can guess why he lost." At that time, the boy surnamed Su said that he was in an out-of-body state to cultivate his spirit. He also had Gao Shulu's celestial being body. He looked like he was on par with me, Tuoba Bodhisattva, and Chao Chongqing. However, he was qualified to challenge Wang Xianji to a death battle. But as for life and death, it should not have been old Monster Wong who died. Therefore, I guess that at the last moment, old Monster Wong made the same mistake as Gao Shulu. He gave up on Jianghu and wanted to surpass Su Fengnian in the word Tao. Dong Tai nodded to himself and said, "Most likely so. Just like me, after I reach the celestial being realm by luck, if I kill people with my swordsmanship, even if I kill people, I will feel that I have an unfair advantage." Tan Tai Ping Jing said sarcastically, "Should every number 1 person in the world be conceited?" Dong Tai shook his head and said with a smile, "Conceited? You are so wrong. I should say that if you don't have the spirit of being invincible against the world, you won't be able to become a celestial being." Tan Tai Ping Jing fell into silence. Dong Tai said softly, "After Li Chungang lent me his sword, he understood his own limitations. It's not that I am arrogant, but my sword has indeed cultivated the sword aura to the extreme and the speed of my sword to the extreme. I, Dong Tai, have cultivated my swordsmanship to the point of almost reaching the Tao but still not reaching the Tao. However, my swordsmanship is small but not big enough. Therefore, I rode my sword out to sea for tens of thousands of miles. Senior Tan Tai, you have lived alone on an island in the sea for a long time, so you should have seen the sea often. You will understand the magnificent concept of burning the sun and spitting out clouds, swallowing the river and washing the moon. Along the way, when I was in the mood, I cut down hundreds of islands with my sword one after another. I also followed the tide and finally comprehended the swordsmanship." At this point, Dong Tai stopped talking and looked at the sky in the distance. Tan Tai Ping Jing sighed and said, "No matter how many bolts of lightning there is a rule. The power of the last bolt of lightning must be the sum of all the previous bolts of lightning." Dong Tai clicked his tongue and said, "The last part of 100 miles is 90 miles? Tan Tai Ping Jing asked, "You don't want to help?" Dong Tai glanced at the real dragon with golden eyes and shook his head. He said in a low voice, "What's there to help? Would I ask Chao Chongqing to deal with Wang Xianji? Would Chao Chongqing ask Su Fengnian to assassinate the Emperor of Liang? Would Su Fengnian ask for help to kill Empress Murong?" Dong Tai suddenly laughed and said helplessly, "If it's possible, this kid will most likely do it. Why does Wu Su have such a scoundrel as a son?" Tan Tai Ping Jing said indifferently, "He's also Su Zhao's son." Dong Tai sighed and said, "Yes, but the 3 of them are all stubborn and one-track-minded." "Sure enough, they're like family." Tan Tai Ping Jing smiled and said, "If it's not like this, would Dong Tai teach Su Fengnian the flying sword?" Chapter 13:19. In fact, Tan Tai Ping Jing was very reluctant to talk to others. However, the 7th heavenly thunder was about to strike down, which made her very agitated. She had to use words to distract herself and calm herself down. "Who will be your final opponent after you comprehend the sword?" Dong Tai thought for a while and said, "Probably Chen Zhibao after transcendence. This young man is too tolerant." Tan Tai Ping Jing did not feel strange about this. Xie Guanyin, who went to Shu State to assist Chen Zhibao, was very shrewd. He hid deeper than Xuan Benshi, the Emperor of Liang. After almost 20 years of planning, he chose Chen Zhibao in order to make the shaky aristocratic families rise again. Because once Chen Zhibao was determined to fight for the world, he would definitely need the help of those aristocratic families. In the future, when he unified the country, those forces behind Xie Guanyin would definitely follow him. In fact, Xie Guaniying's enemies were 3 people in succession. Su Xiao, who destroyed the foundation of his family, Huang Longshe, who added fuel to the fire, and Zhang Julu, who opened the door for the poor. Now one was dead, and the other 2 were about to die. Xie Guaniying had a great chance of winning. Dong Tai said, "Coming." He and Tan Tai Ping Jing almost fell back at the same time. The Beimang dragon also turned around and left, shaking its tail and swaying its whiskers. In the dark purple sky, it was as if a god had pried a mountain and thrown it into the sea. A circle of violent ripples that could be seen by the naked eye appeared in the sky, and then quickly spread out. The earth trembled in resonance with it, and the snow and yellow sand rolled together. A purple thunderlight column slowly penetrated the rippling lake, like a stone pillar smashed into the water. Su Fengnian used qi to control the Baoyang saber. It was not the left-hand saber that once pierced through the Bronze Man Grandmaster's strongest hand, but the saber was held with both hands for the first time. He raised his head and looked at the 7th heavenly thunder. Su Fengnian, whose sleeve seemed to be full of wind and thunder, had a smile at the corner of his mouth. Withstanding the heavenly lightning was a skill. It was a pity that old Huang and the old man in the sheepskin fur coat were not here. Otherwise, one of them would be grinning from ear to ear, revealing his missing front teeth, and the other would probably be picking his ears, squinting his eyes, and pursing his lips. When he was young, he looked forward to the Jianghu. He always thought that if an expert walked the Jianghu without a bit of elegance, how would there be cheers and applause? He didn't expect that the 2 experts he respected the most didn't have the slightest bit of elegance. Tan Tai Ping Jing, who had been retreating for several miles, had been staring at the magnificent battlefield. That was the literal battle between heaven and man. In her line of sight, she only saw a bolt of purple lightning and a flash of white light. The vast purple lightning was then split into 2 by the slender white light, transforming into 2 torrents of purple lightning that flowed onto the ground. The white light rose higher and higher. The purple lightning continued to surge downwards as if there was no end in sight. In Tan Tai Pingjing's eyes, there seemed to be a huge human character. If the layer of lake was added, it would be an incomplete character. The white light, which was as bright as a comet, was climbing slower and slower. It began to show signs of stagnation. Although it was only 100 feet away from the lake, it was really difficult to go any further. Tan Tai Pingjing's expression was sorrowful. Human strength is sometimes limited. I can only do my best and wait for God's will. Sailing against the current, if you don't go forward, you will go backward. After the white light completely stopped, the purple lightning didn't stop. The white light was pressed down to the ground 1 foot at a time. Dong Tai laughed loudly. Who said that? An ant trying to shake a big tree. How admirable! When the white light fell to the ground, there was a muffled roar from the ground. Su Fengnian, who was holding the saber with both hands, didn't change his grip on the saber in his right hand. His left hand slid along the back of the cold saber. Then, without caring about the sharp edge, his 5 fingers grasped the tip of the saber tightly. The purple lightning under his feet was like a flood. Su Fengnian's arms were badly mangled. He held on. He didn't let go. He didn't abandon the saber. The purple lightning poured down for a whole incense stick. Tan Tai Pingjing almost couldn't bear to watch. She murmured, "After the 7th lightning, there is an 8th lightning." Su Fengnian was bleeding from his 7 orifices. His vision had long been blurred. But in a trance, he seemed to see the tip of the cold saber. A purple gold lotus bloomed. It was very small, but swaying vigorously. On the ground where the purple flood was flowing, 1, 2, 3. Lotus flowers bloomed one after another, like a lotus pond. And the endless purple lightning in the sky finally came to an end. The more it was like this, the more desolate Tan Tai Pingjing felt. She repeated the sentence again. After the 7th lightning, there is an 8th lightning. Dong Tai stared at the ferocious dragon that was not just watching from the sidelines. It took advantage of the gap between the 7th lightning and the 8th lightning to secretly absorb the purple lightning. Its body had already reached the size of 100 feet. Su Fengnian stood in the torrent. He could only hang his arms and use the Baoyang saber to support his swaying body. The Beimang dragon in the distant sky twitched the corners of its mouth and made a sound like a sneer. However, it quickly widened its golden eyes, revealing a look of confusion and fear. That insignificant ant rose high into the sky and stood opposite it from a distance at the same height as it. At this moment, Not only Tan Tai Pingjing's face was filled with disbelief, but even Dong Tai's eyes widened. Inside the lotus pond, a snow-white python that was 2,000 feet long appeared. Su Fengnian stood on the head of the giant python. The dragon and the python looked at each other. Purple lightning rolled above the heads of the two behemoths. Tan Tai Pingjing closed her eyes. Dong Tai sighed. The final choice is not to withstand the 8th lightning, but Dong Tai didn't say it out loud. Slaying the dragon. The giant python slammed toward the true dragon. The Beimang dragon kept absorbing the purple lightning. But when the dragon python was less than 10 feet away, the true dragon had only grown to 150 feet. The true dragon raised its head and roared at the giant python that was a head taller than it. The giant white python ignored its demonstration. It opened its mouth and bit down on the true dragon's neck. Su Fengnian held the saber with both hands, jumped high, and stabbed down. Su Fengnian stabbed the saber into the true dragon's head. The giant python that was biting the true dragon's neck pulled down at the same time. The man, the dragon, and the python fell together. They fell heavily to the ground. Su Fengnian pressed down with both hands. The cold saber's blade was nailed into the true dragon's head, leaving only the saber handle. The dragon and the python tore at each other. The world turned upside down. When the dust settled, the Beimang dragon's head was cut off and rolled to the side. The white python was on its last breath. Su Fengnian held the saber under his armpit. His face was covered in blood. It was unknown whether he was crying or laughing. He reached out his trembling hand and placed it on the head of the fallen white python. At the same time, the 8th bolt of lightning fell from the sky, exploding toward the man and the python. The sword-biting youth who had been running all the way back brazenly crashed into the bolt of lightning. Chapter 13:20. As the purple thunder pierced through the sky like a rainbow, the wind and snow were attracted by it and drifted down. Dong Tai's left shoulder was soon covered with snow, while his right shoulder was much lighter. Dong Tai patted his shoulder and asked curiously, "Is that real dragon so useless? People say that a mountain is famous if it has an immortal, not because of its height, and a water is famous if it has a dragon. I don't know how powerful a flood dragon is, but I'm sure that any immortal on Earth would be seriously injured after this attack, but they would never die. Since the true dragon that was born after devouring the fortune of countless mortals could create such a huge commotion, it should not be so weak. Is there anything strange about this?" Tan Tai Ping looked calmly at the dragon and python crawling on the ground in the distance with a complicated expression. Her 5 fingers were trembling in her big white sleeves. She shook her head and said, "Dragons can be big or small, and can be dark or bright. The degree of injury depends on the size of its body. The more serious the injury, the smaller its body will be. As for whether it will die or not, it depends on whether it spits out the dragon pearl condensed from its essence and hides in the abyss, waiting for the next reincarnation. Otherwise, even if its head is chopped off, it still has a chance to turn from bright to dark. Now, even if the real dragon of Beimang's head is chopped off, the dragon pearl hasn't been spat out." Deng Tea patted away the falling snow on his shoulder. He simply raised his hand and waved it gently. The flying snow in the sky seemed to have hit a furnace and melted completely in the air a few feet away from him. If it were any other time, Deng Tea would definitely not do such an unnecessary action. It could be seen that after personally witnessing this great battle, even he, the Peach Blossom Sword God, who led the way of the sword, could not remain indifferent. After Deng Tea blocked the annoying drifting snow, he seemed to have realized that he was acting strangely. He laughed softly and said, "What mean you? I am a boar." Tan Tai Pingjing patiently explained, "There are also 9 levels in Go. It's quite similar when used on the dragon. The last 4 levels are, from lowest to highest, concrete, ethereal, meditative, and enigmatic. Previously, the real dragon was restrained by the way of heaven contained in my sex treasure, the Moonwell Heavenly Mirror. From enigmatic, it temporarily fell from enigmatic to concrete. Even if it stole 1.5 bolts of heavenly tribulation purple thunder, it only rose to meditation. Because of this, the white python was able to gain the upper hand because of Su Fengnian's help. Otherwise, in an ordinary battle between pythons and dragons, even if it was 1,000 feet long giant python that was the master of a great river, it wouldn't have much of a chance of winning against a baby dragon that was only 100 feet long. At this point, Tan Tai Pingjing sighed and lamented, "Even a centipede dies but doesn't fall down, let alone a real dragon that is compatible with the way of heaven." Dong Tai turned his head and glanced at the tall lady beside him whose sleeves were as big as the wings of a white phoenix. He said helplessly, "It's getting more and more obscure. Fortunately, I managed to understand the mystery behind it. Sect Master Tan Tai, are you implying that the real dragon still has the strength to fight? The real dragon is cunning, but that lad is not bad either. He made use of the thunder pool to bloom the purple gold lotus. Now that both sides are injured and no one has external help to rely on, what else can they do other than staring at each other?" Tan Tai Ping Jing did not say anything. Her 10 fingers stretched out from the edge of her sleeves and clenched her sleeves tightly in her palms. Dong Tai muttered to himself, "Everything depends on whether Su Longxiang can withstand the last bolt of heavenly tribulation. If he can't, with Su Fengnian, the real dragon of Beimang is destined to stand out and take the opportunity to hit him when he is down. Moreover, the Qi cultivators of Beimang are not to be trifled with. Other than sending out the real dragon, it's impossible that they don't have a backup plan." Tan Tai Ping Jing asked, "Dong Tai, are you just going to stand by and do nothing?" "Stand by and do nothing? That's quite appropriate." Dong Tai looked directly at the Qi cultivator grandmaster, who led the entire Guanyin sect to the northwest border. He laughed and asked in return, "I don't care what the heavenly tribulation wants, what the Su family brothers want, and even what the real dragon and the Qi cultivators of Beimang want. Both sides will compete in their skills and leave it to fate. However, if someone wants to take advantage of the situation, they have to ask whether I, Dong Tai, agree or not." Tan Tai Pingjing's expression was as usual as she asked, "What do you mean?" Dong Tai turned his head and looked at the battlefield in the distance. Both the dragon and the python suffered heavy losses. Taking the unique talisman weapons for themselves is a huge amount of merit. On the battlefield, such a military merit should not be inferior to the merit of a general who destroyed a country, right? Sect Master Tan Tai, if it were you Qi cultivators, would it be possible for you to ask the heavens for a favor? Tan Tai Pingjing's expression changed slightly. Dong Tai ignored the subtle change in Tan Tai Pingjing's expression. He crossed his arms and looked at the high clouds in the sky. He sneered and said, "In the past, Dong Tai only pursued the path of swordsmanship and looked far and wide. However, from now on, I'm really tired of these condescending scheming. They can't cut through generations and generations, and it's chaotic and sloppy. Everyone is treated as a puppet." Dong Tai snorted heavily. The Wu family has buried hundreds of thousands of swords in the sword tomb. Dong Tai has not taken a single sword. Until now, I have not taken a single sword. Tan Tai Ping Jing, who had always stood aloof from worldly affairs, did not back down. For the first time, she went head-to-head with someone. She asked, "Why? Are you threatening me?" Dong Tai laughed heartily. "Do you think you're worthy?" Tan Tai Pingjing's chest heaved up and down. It was obvious that she was furious. However, she did not say anything in the end. The lightning pool that bloomed from the purple gold lotus gradually withered. The snow-white giant python that had broken through to the meditation realm lost its support. Its aura dissipated and it was on the verge of death. After exchanging a glance with Su Fengnian, it slowly closed its eyes. Su Fengnian, who had a saber under his armpit, stood with his back against the giant python's head. He stared at the head of the true dragon that was as tall as a human. "Still playing dead? Can't you act like a true dragon?" The golden eyes of the dragon head that had a deathly still aura were still lifeless. However, after hearing Su Fengnian's words, the 2 dragon whiskers swayed leisurely. Su Fengnian saw that it was finally too lazy to hide its strength. He shifted his gaze slightly upwards and looked at the empty sky. He said, "If I'm not wrong, you're waiting for Beimang's Shijing Qi refinement warrior to give you the finishing touch and rebirth at the cost of more than 100 lives, right?" The eyes of the true dragon were lifeless. However, the 2 dragon whiskers swayed gracefully like 2 lotuses in the wind, causing mysterious patterns to appear in the air. Su Fengnian laughed. "It doesn't matter who lives and who dies. Anyway, there's such a Qi refinement warrior who can benefit from the fight between the snipe and the clam. Before you enter the state of mind, she can take out the lunar well heavenly mirror to subdue and suppress you. Are you willing to accept that?" The dragon whiskers swayed, creating ripples and sounds. It spoke solemnly through the mouth of heaven and earth. It was full of sarcasm and contempt. And, after hearing the words, Su Fengnian's heart beat like a drum. The clothes on his chest were torn apart. However, he looked happy. He even had the mood to raise his arm and wipe the bloodstains on his face. He smiled and said, "It's not easy for ants to praise a big country. It's not easy for an ant to shake a tree. Of course, I've heard of this principle. Whether it's a true dragon like you or a group of celestial beings who have been in a high position for a long time, they all look at the world like frogs at the bottom of a well. The life and death of the world are controlled by the fishing rods in your hands. Then, you use the words longevity as bait to lure them. It's called the cycle of heaven and the wide net of justice." At this point, Su Fengnian, who was still wiping his face, did not completely put down his arm. The cold saber hung diagonally under his armpit. A drop of blood from the specific realm of a true dragon slid down from the tip of the saber. He raised his eyebrows and glanced at the sky. The corners of his mouth twitched. "I don't like to talk much when I fight. I try not to talk if I can. You and I both know the reason why I'm talking so much to you. You're waiting, and I have to slowly recover. After the death battle with Wang Xianji, more than half of the celestial being physique that Gao Shulu gave me was damaged. Its qi kept leaking out. However, I didn't repair it. Instead, I went to Mount Wudong to learn a secret technique. I devoted myself to perfecting the pond in my body. I didn't hesitate to walk with a limp on the path of martial arts." Su Fengnian tilted his head and spat out a mouthful of blood. People were used to describing a person's extreme pain as pain that penetrated the bone marrow or the heart. However, Su Fengnian's qi was shattered from the inside out. The pain was even more exaggerated. It was like an ordinary person who had never practiced martial arts. His skin and bones were being crushed inch by a small hammer, and his tendons and veins were constantly being poked by fine needles. However, his mind was always maintaining a clear thought process. Su Fengnian's expression was somewhat ferocious. "It's really painful. I haven't gotten used to it even after experiencing it a few times." The lightning spear that Duanbo Air brought back was no different from scratching an itch. As he spoke, the mouthful of blood that was about to fall to the ground turned into a red serpent-like spiritual creature. It scuttled back to Su Fengnian's body and seeped into his skin. Red threads could be seen everywhere on Su Fengnian's exposed skin. They were like snakes flicking their tongues. Su Fengnian, who had recovered some of his strength, held out the Baelyong saber covered in true dragon blood and wiped it on the snow-white python's forehead. The two strands of dragon whiskers shook violently, as if it was angry. Su Fengnian let out a long breath and said softly, "Huang Manor, hold on a little longer." A streak of resplendent white light originated from Shijing and rapidly shot from Beimang into Liuzhou. Upon closer inspection, it was actually two streams of light twisting together, like two dragons chasing a pearl. Su Fengnian did his best to straighten his back, revealing a rare serious expression. He held the saber in his left hand and opened his right hand. He lifted the cold saber and slashed it across his palm. He clenched his fist tightly. At this moment, behind Su Fengnian, who was facing the dragon head, the young man biting his sword and charging forward forcefully collided with the purple lightning. The lightning that was supposed to strike Su Fengnian's back was intercepted by the young man. After the collision, the thin young man's feet fell to the ground and his body leaned back. The originally straight trajectory of the purple lightning slightly deviated, showing a slight twist. The dazzling purple lightning madly sputtered above the young man's head. The young man was knocked into the ground by the unstoppable purple lightning, his knees sinking deep into the ground. The calm wind ripple in the young man's mouth had cut a gap in the front of the purple lightning, but it was still not enough to break through the purple lightning. The purple light crazily lingered around the long sword. The long sword trembled like the mournful cry of an autumn cicada. Chapter 13:21. How could a famed sword, calm the storm, block this purple lightning? Huang Manor and Su Longxiang's faces were embedded in the purple thunder. On the surface, the eighth bolt of purple lightning was only as thick as a tree. It was not very shocking, only slightly better than the sixth bolt of heavenly lightning that was as thin as a thread. It was even far inferior to the first bolt of lightning that was destroyed by Su Fengnian's azure dragon sleeve. The heavenly thunder was as thick as a water tank. However, Tan Tai Pingjing and Dong Tai, who were watching from the side, knew very well that this purple thunder was enough to peel off hundreds of heavenly thunder, which was as powerful as the sixth heavenly thunder. If Huang Qing could live to see this scene, he would probably die. No matter how unwilling he was, he would be able to die in peace. This was Su Longxiang's real strength after entering the celestial state. With such terrifying strength, Any chi cultivator would feel that it was intolerable. A figure suddenly appeared beside the youth. It was an old man in a yellow and purple Taoist robe. Huang Manor, who was biting the long sword, turned his head with difficulty, allowing the purple thunder to hit his neck. The old Taoist priest closed his eyes and faced the youth. The old and the youth met again after a long separation. The old man grinned. The purple golden lotus that bloomed on the tip of Su Fengyan's blade was the tragic result of the old man's life. Purple golden lotus completely withered. The old Taoist priest's figure disappeared at a speed visible to the naked eye. The youth's face was shrouded in purple light. His lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. It was impossible to see whether the youth was crying. The old Taoist priest, whose lower body had disappeared, turned his head and glanced at Su Fengyan. Su, don't die. It doesn't matter if you bring wine to the grave in the future. Just burn a few more copies of the Plain Girl Heart Sutra. Disciple. I just reincarnated first. In the next life, we'll be master and disciple. Also, there are so many hawthorns on the mountain this year. It's a pity that you're not here. Without your help, I can't finish all the hawthorns I picked. The old man turned his head to look at the young man. It was as if he had returned to the dilapidated Taoist temple at the foot of Mount Longhu. As usual, he rambled on and on. Finally, the old man pointed his finger at the sky and said angrily, Huang Manor, F***ck that heavenly tribulation. A heavenly master of a generation had passed away just like that. The youth, who had turned his neck to look at the old man, was struck by the heavenly thunder and lowered his head more and more. He tried to raise his drooping arm, wanting to reach out and grab his master to prevent the old man from leaving. But to no avail. The young man took a step forward. Suddenly, his abdomen vibrated like a drum, resonating with the earth and creating circles of ripples. When things are unjust, they cry out. Apart from the circle around the brothers and the dragon python, the ground within a radius of 5 kilometers instantly collapsed. However, at the turning point where Su Longxiang became braver with every setback, the true dragon, who was on the verge of death but didn't die in the specific realm, obtained a powerful new life, like rain after a long drought. After the two intertwined white lights approached the true dragon's head, they suddenly parted ways and then instantly crashed into the true dragon's lifeless eyes. The finishing touch. The true dragon opened its eyes. The true dragon's body, whose head had been separated from its body, propped its 4 dragon claws into the ground. The head that had been cut off by the cold blade swept back to the body, seamlessly and as before. The true dragon flew into the sky and disappeared without a trace. In the next moment, the true dragon's head poked out of the clouds and looked down at the world. Its tail was faintly discernible in the clouds 800 feet away. Tantai Pingjing said in a daze, It shouldn't be like this, it shouldn't be like this. 1,000 feet, heavenly dragon. Su Fengyan turned a blind eye to this and muttered to himself, I originally wanted to let you show up when I went to the ancient city of Luoyang. A drop of blood slowly fell from the gap of his fist. When the drop of blood was 3 feet away from the ground, Su Fengyan shouted softly and said in a low voice, Please. Dong. Like a drop of water hitting the quiet surface of the water, the sound was particularly obvious. The heavenly dragon, which was thousands of feet long, spat out a ball of heavenly thunder and rushed to the ground. A burly man appeared in front of Su Fengyan where the blood was dripping. His whole body was overflowing with golden light. Perhaps in the thousands of years of the Central Plains, there were hundreds of emperors and monarchs in the history books, but none of them could be mentioned in the same breath as him. He put one hand behind his back and stretched out the other hand, casually holding up the heavenly thunder. The burly man who had his back to Su Fengyan said calmly, Pass a message to her. Just say, I'm guilty. Su Fengyan didn't say anything. He turned to face the south and squeezed out a second drop of blood. Please again. A man who looked like a scholar appeared in front of Su Fengyan with a smile. He nodded and smiled at Su Fengyan. Don't ask me where I'm from. Think about where I'm going and who I'm going to see. I'm the one who said this to Lu Dongxuan's 6th life. It's also for myself. Won't you regret it after today? Su Fengyan pointed at his heart. The man smiled knowingly. His hair was white, but it didn't affect his incomparable elegance. He looked at a tall woman in the distance who was covering her mouth and sobbing. He said softly, Silly big girl. Then he raised his palm with one hand. A bright moon slowly rose from his palm. The pale-faced Su Fengyan turned to the north and said in a low voice, Please. A beam of light suddenly descended from a height of tens of thousands of miles. It was a Zhenwu Dharmakaya. However, it was different from the majestic scene on the Spring God Lake. This time, the appearance of the Zhenwu Dharmakaya was full of an oppressive aura that went against the way of heaven. Above the 9 heavens, countless golden threads like fishing lines drew arcs and fell. They bounced up from the ground and wrapped around the limbs of the Zhenwu Dharmakaya. However, even if this kind of appearance went against the way of heaven, not a single fishing line dared to appear near the head of the Zhenwu Dharmakaya. However, the extraordinary flower-scattering fairies around the Dharmakaya were torn apart by the fishing lines that intertwined into a net. Dong Tai didn't care about Tan Tai Pingjing's inexplicable loss of composure. His face was full of shock. He smiled bitterly and said, "Wang Xianji, you're a monster, but this guy is a madman." After Tan Tai Pingjing came back to her senses, she bowed respectfully. She sobbed and lowered her head. "Master, you said that the way of heaven wants people to bow their heads, but the way of heaven wants the turtle in the East Sea and the frog at the bottom of the well to enjoy themselves." "I was wrong, and I understand." When the Zhenwu Dharmakaya raised its foot, the battle began. With one hand, the Dharma idol tore off the densely packed golden-yellow fishing lines on its body. With one foot, it broke the purple lightning that was still relentlessly attacking the young Huang man. The purple thunder broke into 2 pieces like a fishing rod. The Dharmakaya that took a step forward held the 2 pieces of purple thunder in its hands. It threw one piece back into the sky and the other toward the Beimang sky dragon. According to the ancient books, the water dragon and the mountain python turned into a flood dragon in 500 years. A flood dragon turned into a true dragon in 1,000 years. After another 1,000 years, it finally became a supreme sky dragon. The Beimang true dragon shouldn't have become a sky dragon so quickly, but the way of heaven was like this. The sky dragon swimming in the clouds was an enemy of the Zhenwu Dharmakaya. It was respectful but fearless. It stretched out its claws and pressed on the half of the purple thunder. The dragon's claws were penetrated by the thunder spear. The sky dragon lowered its head and broke through the clouds. It roared toward the ground and spat out another purple thunder from its mouth. Su Fengnian said expressionlessly, "Regardless of whether you are in heaven or earth, you dare to be presumptuous in the north." The Zhenwu Dharmakaya opened its mouth slowly at the same time. Its voice was so loud that it echoed between heaven and earth like a great bell. After the Zhenwu Dharmakaya spoke, the sky dragon that raised the sea of clouds showed its true body that was thousands of feet tall. It was no longer covered by clouds. However, at the same time, a majestic beam of light fell from the east, west, and south respectively. Heaven and earth shook. Su Fengnian, who seemed to have regained consciousness before death, showed a sickly glow. He turned his head and nodded at the Zhenwu Dharmakaya, whose Dharmakaya was almost illusory. The burly man with the aura of an emperor had already casually removed the purple thunder. He smiled and asked, "What are you waiting for?" When the elegant man with the moon in his palm opened his 5 fingers, the moonlight was unparalleled. The full moon turned into rays of light that flowed into the Baoyang saber in Su Fengnian's hand. He smiled and said, "The heavens have no worries, the people have no worries. I have discussed the Tao with Lu Dongxian III 3 times. I feel that it is reasonable to not interfere with each other's business. The reason is the reason, the great Tao is the reason. If it is not in accordance with the great Tao, then it is not reason." As he spoke, the light dissipated. The elegant man's figure began to waver. The great Qin emperor suddenly laughed and appeared at the feet of the Zhenwu Dharmakaya. He sat in the north and looked to the south. Before he turned into rays of light and dissipated into the Zhenwu Dharmakaya, he shouted, "Get lost!" The 3 majestic beams of light in the east, west, and south actually stagnated and trembled. Not to be outdone, the 3 pillars of light instantly skyrocketed. However, Su Fengnian was already holding the saber with both hands. The Zhenwu Dharmakaya also held the saber. The sky dragon's 4 claws pressed down heavily from the sky. Its 2 strands of dragon whiskers trembled violently. It held the dragon pearl in its mouth. The huge pearl was like the scorching sun in the sky. Su Fengnian stepped out and slashed down with his saber. The Zhenwu Dharmakaya also stepped forward and slashed down with his saber. A crescent moon was slashed out in the sky. It slashed down on the huge pearl that was hovering in the sky like the sun. This scene was like the collision of the sun and the moon. The scales on the sky dragon's 1,000 feet long body shook violently. Su Fengnian's saber slashed down, but it stopped halfway as if it was splitting a mountain. A small crack appeared on the saber's blade. The flesh on Su Fengnian's palms that held the saber were ground to pieces. Finally, the white bones touched the saber hilt. The sky dragon that was clawing at the ground with its 4 claws was forced to retreat step by step. It kept roaring. Su Fengnian's body exploded into a scarlet rain of blood. He roared, "I am slaying a sky dragon." The cold saber broke into 2 with a bang. Su Fengnian fell heavily to the ground. High in the sky, the dragon pearl also exploded with a bang. The crescent moon cut the Baimang sky dragon's head behind the dragon pearl into 2 halves. The earth shook. The huge white python that was far less than the 10,000 feet long sky dragon jumped up. It opened its mouth and swallowed the sky dragon's head and half of its body. After the giant python that had already swallowed half of the sky dragon's head pulled it to the ground, it continued to devour the last half of the dragon's body. Heaven and earth returned to silence. There were no more sky humans or sky dragons. The heavy snow finally fell without restraint. Su Fengnian slayed the dragon. The cold python swallowed the dragon. Chapter 13:22. Su Fengnian was sitting cross-legged on the ground, covered in blood. He looked even more battered and exhausted after the snow mixed with his blood. Su Fengnian gasped for breath, each breath seeming like it was tearing apart his internal organs. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the broken Bailiang blade and wanted to retrieve it. However, he spat out a mouthful of blood as soon as the thought came to mind. At this moment, a snow-white creature with a strange tail slithered out from behind him. It was no more than 3 feet long and had a slender body like a snake. There were 2 horns on its forehead like a flood dragon, 2 whiskers like a carp, and 4 claws. It suddenly moved as fast as lightning and bit the broken blade onto Su Fengnian's leg. It raised its little head and wagged its tail at Su Fengnian as if it was asking for praise. Su Fengnian smiled and extended his hand. The little fellow suddenly turned its body and hovered motionlessly in the air, seemingly pretending not to see anything. Su Fengnian bent his finger and gently tapped on its head. The snake-like creature fell onto Su Fengnian's knee with a thud. First it pretended to be blind, and now it was playing dead. Su Fengnian, his face covered in blood, laughed involuntarily and said, "That bead is already shattered. Even if you swallow it, it'll take at least a few hundred years to completely digest it. It won't be of much benefit to you or me, but Huang Manor needs it to nourish his body and condense his soul. Spit it out obediently and I'll count to 3. In the end, when Su Fengnian counted to 3, the little fellow lying on his knee twitched on purpose, as if to express that it had died heroically in battle. Su Fengnian twirled its tail with 2 fingers and said helplessly, "As expected of my natal item. It's just like me when it's acting like a rascal. Fine, fine. I promise you that after we return to Liangzhou, you can eat all the koi fish in Tidehark Lake." The little fellow's head floated up to the same level as its tail and tilted back slightly. Its head and tail joined together to form a cute little circle, just like a lively dragon wall. It hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly opened its mouth and spat out a bead with visible cracks. It was as small as a grain of rice, but it radiated the brilliance of the sun and moon. After spitting out the pearl, the little thing was somewhat dispirited and listless. In a flash, it disappeared into thin air. Su Fengnian held the 2 sections of the cold blade in one hand and pinched the bead with 2 fingers in the other. He stood up with difficulty and turned to walk towards Su Longxiang. The young man stood there in a daze. The body of the famed sword storm calming in his mouth and his hanging arms had dazzling lightning swirling around them. Even Su Fengnian was shocked by his imposing manner. However, this kind of power was like a dynasty that seemed to be at its peak but was actually surrounded by danger and would collapse at the slightest touch. Su Fengnian didn't approach Su Longxiang, whose qi was extremely chaotic. He loosened his fingers and opened his palm. The broken dragon bead began to spin in his palm. Su Fengnian pushed forward and the bead slid out of his palm. However, it quickly bounced back. If Su Fengnian hadn't turned sideways in a hurry, he would have been hit by the bead. To the martial artists of Jianghu, this bead was an unimaginable tonic. Its effect of nourishing the essence, qi, and spirit was unparalleled. The bead probably felt Su Fengnian's resistance and could only spin around. To the spiritual bead, its choice of Huang Manor as the dragon cave was naturally far inferior to Su Fengnian, who was a natural matchmaker. Tantai Pingjing swept to Su Fengnian's side and asked with a complicated expression, "If you don't take what is given by heaven, aren't you afraid of being punished?" Su Fengnian said indifferently. In order to withstand the sky thunder, Huang Manor sealed his heart acupoint. His 3 souls and 7 spirits are very unstable. Even if he becomes a celestial being, he will be no different from Gao Shulu who has lost her mind. Tantai Ping Jing, if you help me, I won't fuss about your sinister intention of trying to take both dragon and python. Tantai Pingjing's mind was full of thoughts. She didn't agree or refuse. Su Fengnian suddenly smiled mischievously and said, Then I'm begging you, blockhead. Can you do it? At most, I'll return the Moon Well Sky Mirror to you later. Tantai Pingjing was stunned and looked absent-minded. It was unknown when Deng Tea had appeared beside the two of them. He chuckled softly and said, You're still flirting at a time like this? Tantai Pingjing turned her head and looked at the young man who was absorbing the chi of heaven and earth crazily. Her expression became serious. Deng Tea touched a sore spot and joked, Yo, our sect master Tantai is at least 100 years old, and yet she can still act like a shy little girl. Look, her ears are red. Tantai Pingjing ignored the peach blossom sword god's ridicule and sighed softly. Even if I help, I'm afraid it's too late. There's only one obsession left to become a celestial being. If I don't cut it, even if Dong Tai takes the sword and I send the pearl, it's meaningless. Su Longxiang still can't return to the human world. Moreover, whether I send the pearl or Dong Tai takes the sword, the price will be very high. Tantai Pingjing raised her hand and waved her sleeve. A breeze rolled up a handful of yellow sand and floated to the young man. The sand didn't turn into powder immediately. Instead, it shot into the lake like an arrow and slowed down bit by bit. However, in the slow process, there was a kind of natural and unreasonable weathering. It was natural because the weathering of sand in the desert was a matter of course. It was unreasonable because under normal circumstances, it wouldn't take a few years or even dozens of years for the weathering of sand in the desert. This strange phenomenon was like a toddler who had just learned how to walk. After one step, he would become a teenager. After a few more steps, he would reach middle age and old age, until he died of old age. Dong Tai clicked his tongue in wonder and said, This is the way of heaven. Tantai Pingjing said worriedly, The so-called celestial being realm means to forget about the world without worries. When everyone is awake, I sleep alone. Just like what the saints said, Lazy travels alone with the wind. How to wake Su Longxiang up is the most difficult part. Dong Tai smiled and said, It's useless to talk about it. I have a sword. As he spoke, Dong Tai put 2 of his fingers together, raised them up, and then gently chopped down. If it was said that Su Longxiang's surroundings followed the rules of the heavenly Tao and formed a small kiliocosm of its own, and this part of the world was in chaos like a chicken egg, then Deng Tea's sword momentum was about to split open the world and split the chicken egg in half. Dong Tai laughed loudly and said, After splitting the mountain, I'll use another sword. Let's call it paving the road. The finger sword cut the mountain, and the mountain was about to close. Dong Tai then released streaks of sword aura between the mountains, forcibly blocking the gathering of the way of heaven. Dong Tai rode the wind and flew forward. After leaping over Su Longxiang's head, the calm wind ripple with purple lightning appeared in his hand. After the peach blossom sword deity went straight through the thunder pool of heaven, his figure went further and further. He knocked his fingers and flicked his sword. He laughed and said, Splitting the mountain and paving the road, 2 swords in exchange for a good sword. We don't owe each other anything. Chapter 1323. Almost as soon as Dong Tai took the first step, Tantai Pingjing took the bead from Su Fengnian and followed closely behind Dong Tai. The path was as narrow as a sword's length. Tantai Pingjing, dressed in white, followed Dong Tai and flew over Su Longxiang's head like a white phoenix. At the same time, she shook her wrist and slapped the bead into the young man's chest. When Tantai Pingjing landed in the distance, she felt as if she had walked through the gate of hell. She still had lingering fear, as if her soul was trembling. The feeling was even stronger than that of surviving a life-and-death battle. It was because she was a top chi trainer in the world and someone who knew the strictness of the natural law best that she felt the lingering fear. The reason was simple. If Zhang Julu, the Grand Secretary of the Imperial Court, was traveling incognito in Taiyan City, ordinary people could ignore him if they didn't know his identity. However, if an official working in the 6 ministries passed by the blue-eyed man, he would inevitably feel as if he was walking on thin ice. Dong Tai and Tantai Pingjing passed through the thunder pool one after the other. It happened in the blink of an eye. She turned her head and showed a shocked expression. The 2 mountains merged, but Su Fengnian was standing beside Su Longxiang. Tantai Pingjing knew that Su Fengnian went there with the help of the Yujing Sky Mirror, and he could also leave with the help of the Yujing Sky Mirror. However, the key was that in the middle of this trip, Su Fengnian was not going there to enjoy the scenery, but to wake up his younger brother Su Longxiang. Tantai Pingjing could be 10 years older or even a month later. Perhaps in less than half an hour, she would see a hunchbacked old man with white hair instead of a young king of Bailiang who was only in his 20s. Tantai Pingjing bit her lips. She could understand why Su Fengnian gave the bead to Su Longxiang. It was common for brothers to respect each other in the world. Although it was rare in the families of emperors, generals and ministers, she was not surprised that Su Fengnian was willing to give the good stuff to Su Longxiang. It could even be said that Tantai Pingjing also thought that it was reasonable that Su Fengnian was willing to resist the heaven's punishment for his younger brother. After all, at that time, Su Fengnian still had the strength to fight. However, now the chi pond in Su Fengnian's body had dried up. What else could he do other than die? Tantai Pingjing could not suppress her anger. She suddenly opened her mouth slightly. Su Fengnian seemed to have only said one sentence to his younger brother, and then quickly retreated to the original place. He staggered out of the shaky Yujing Sky Mirror with a bright smile on his face. Tantai Pingjing did not think that one sentence could wake up Su Longxiang. One sentence could break the heaven's law? However, the scene that followed made her believe that rules and reason really didn't work on this pair of brothers. The youth opened his eyes, turned and ran to Su Fengnian. He lowered his head and crouched down, gently carrying the exhausted Su Fengnian. There was a sound of horse hooves in the distance. It should be the 2,000 dragon elephant army that arrived late. Of course, even if this cavalry army arrived early, they would only be caught in the crossfire without any power to retaliate. Tantai Pingjing came to the side of the two brothers. She glanced at Su Fengnian's hands on his younger brother's neck. His palms seemed to have been cut clean by a knife, revealing the shocking white bones. She softly reminded, Wang Xianji's disciple, Lu Huang, is here. In the distance, in the wind and snow, there was a wooden man with an ancient sword, Bodhisattva barbarian, at his waist. The exhausted Su Fengnian had an indifferent face. He smiled and said hoarsely, Lu Huang is here to watch the show. If he really wants to take revenge, he will honestly wait for me to recover my strength. If he is willing to kill a weak enemy, then Lu Huang is not Wang Xianji's disciple. Tantai Pingjing sneered. Lu Huang can wait for that day? Su Fengnian glared at her and said weakly, How can you talk to your master like that? Tantai Pingjing seemed to have been touched. A trace of indistinct murderous intent appeared. Su Fengnian knocked Huang Manor's shoulder with his chin, indicating that he should ignore this woman. Tantai Pingjing's meaning was to ask whether Su Fengnian could return to the peak. This peak obviously could not be the time when he fought Wang Xianji, nor could it be the time when he was invited 3 times. It was before he withstood the last sky thunder. At that time, although Su Fengnian did not have Gao Shulu's physique, he had abundant spirit. Su Fengnian did not want to answer this question directly because he did not have the confidence in his heart. After this battle, he completely separated himself from his previous life. The disadvantage was that he did not have any trump cards. The advantage was that Bailiang would not have any twists and turns because of Su Fengnian's luck. On the other hand, Su Fengnian had a life item and was already closely related to the fate of Bailiang. Once Bailiang was broken, he would certainly die. In this regard, Su Fengnian did not worry about personal gains and losses. He could save Huang Manor and let his younger brother have no worries. Today's big deal was a profit. Doing business with God without any pretense of cordiality, not only did he not lose everything, but he also made a little profit. This was a technical job that made Su Fengnian feel proud of himself. After the battle, Su Fengnian was a little sleepy and his eyelids were fighting. But before he fell asleep, Su Fengnian still had some things to say to his younger brother, so he spoke his mind in a long-winded manner. Huang Manor, I don't want to say nonsense like your master didn't die for you. The old heavenly master sacrificed his life for you. You feel guilty, but I feel the same way. When old Huang left Bailiang for Martial Emperor City, I also thought that because old Huang was a sword fanatic, he went to the Eastern Sea to prove the 3 words, 9 swords Huang. But in fact, I know very well that old Huang went for me. There was no other reason. Perhaps he wanted to tell me that if Su Fengnian did not have Bailiang in the future, there was still the martial world to think about. Perhaps old Huang felt that the first time I walked the martial world with him, He did not give me any face and wanted to leave in glory again. Perhaps, who knows? In short, old Huang left. Just like the old heavenly master, he couldn't escape death in his lifetime. But for us, he died a long time ago. You wanted to kill a few more experts for me. I understand your thoughts, but you didn't do it well. More accurately, you did it in a complete mess. I rushed here to fight this and that, and I really didn't have time to beat you up. Otherwise, I would have already beaten your butt. I want to beat you up now, but I really don't have the strength. When I was young, I clearly did something wrong, but I still liked to argue with Su Xiao. I felt that it was a very satisfying thing, and I was afraid that our father would scold or beat me. After the incident, I always felt that I was a man. But when I grew up, I realized that it was wrong. Huang Manor, don't learn from me. Su Fengyan's nagging voice was getting softer and softer. Su Longxiang didn't interrupt from beginning to end and carefully carried his older brother on his back. When he was young, he had already revealed his innate divine strength. He would often carry his older brother up and down Mount Qingliang. Occasionally, his older brother would even pull a kite in his hand. The big sister, who loved to join in the fun, would run behind them and shout happily, "Fly, fly, fly!" Huang Manor said softly, "Big brother, don't sleep." Chapter 13:24. A large group of people were kneeling in the corridor of a secluded building located in the corner of Shijing's inner court. Not far from the building, there were many corpses lying on the ground. They were all Beimang's most valuable qi cultivators. An old woman in a black robe and a white fur coat stood under the eaves. Her hands were folded in front of her chest, and her sleeves were rolled up like bat wings. This old woman, who made Beimang men grovel under her skirt, rarely got angry. But today, her expression was very ugly. First, the Daoed Sect's immortal Nan Ming, who was good at divination, told her in a trembling voice that the chess and sword music school's bronze ancestor was unknown, and that the sword qi was close to yellow and blue. Then the hibernating cauldron, which was a national treasure, was smashed by an unknown land immortal, and the true dragon that had been raised for more than 20 years broke out of the cauldron. That was not all. Under the rolling thunder, the true dragon that had taken advantage of the situation did not gain any advantage, so she decisively decided to help it. This was because she had always dared to gamble with the heavens. It was fine if she did not gamble, but if she did, she would gamble big. Last time, she won a lot of money, and the entire Beimang dynasty followed her surname. But this time, the immortal Nan Ming told her that she had lost, and the 100 corpses outside the building were proof. In fact, her anger was not because she had lost a battle in Liuzhou of Bailiang that did not affect the overall situation. It was not even because of the death of the true dragon, and definitely not because of those qi cultivators who did not care about the world. What really made the old woman unable to accept was a small matter that could not be told to anyone. When she was at the lowest point of her life, she lost to an unknown brute of Liaodong. When she was at the peak of her power, she lost to his son. The peace warrant stood beside the old woman, and the old man was the only Beimang official who still dared to stand. She finally spoke. Pass down the decree to Dong Zhuo that he is allowed to mobilize all the troops at the border without permission. Regardless of whether it is a general or a military officer, all must listen to him. Those who disobey will be executed by Dong Zhuo first and report later. Pass down the decree to Tuoba Bodhisattva to lead the troops to the south and head straight for Liuzhou. Pass down the order to Li Mixi. Prepare for the carp crossing the river. Pass down the decree to Huang Songpu. Order him to rise and lead the troops to Shijing. Imperial edicts came out of her mouth one after another. She was, after all, an old woman in her twilight years, so it was inevitable that her energy was lacking. For a moment, it was difficult for her to conceal her old weariness. However, today, she did not allow herself to slack off for even a moment. She pulled out her hand from her wide sleeves and abruptly tore off the old fox fur coat on her body, throwing it into the snow outside the steps. Then, she strode away, not looking at the old thing that was constantly accumulating snow again. Great Peace City never lacked excitement, but many of them were hard to join. Once they encountered something they could join, no one was willing to fall behind. Right now, there was a rumor that the new Right Chancellor of the Imperial College, who would replace Jean Sanlang, was going to teach martial arts. Whether it was an armchair strategist or he really had a belly full of strategies, the truth would be known after a walk. The majority of people were there to see a joke. The current Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Rights, Jean Lanting, had a good reputation in the Imperial College. Not only had he obtained many gifts from the Imperial Court for the Imperial College, he had also founded the most famous poetry club in the capital. Together with the 7 scholars in the club, they were known as the 8 talents of Great Peace City. They included the top 3 in the new exam, the top scholar Li Jifu, the second place Gao Tingshu, and the second place Wu Tsongxian. Among them, Gao Tingshu, who had the reputation of being a poet ghost, wrote the popular Drunken 8 Immortals at a banquet, instantly causing the 8 people present to become famous overnight. The 8 talents of Great Peace City came from different backgrounds, like the difference between heaven and earth, but they often sang poems and showed the elegance of scholars. Those with discerning eyes could see that although the head of the 8 talents, Jin Sanlang, was not very popular among the central cabinet officials, the imposing manner that he had slowly gathered could not be underestimated. A provincial pawn called Sun Yin had made an exception to fill the empty position of the Right Chancellor, which was especially abrupt and rude. What was even stranger was that this person did not have any solid backing. Therefore, Sun Yin's rampage, entering the imperial court with the local official Su Gong as the assistant minister of the Ministry of War, and Chen Wang's meteoric rise, became the 3 surprises of the capital's officialdom at the end of the first year of the auspicious talisman, extremely eye-catching. Furthermore, Su Gong, who had the status of Lady Su, had previously had the foundation of being a dragon general. Chen Wang, Chen Xiaobao, had the double foundation of being the crown prince's attendant lecturer and the meritorious service examiner. In contrast, Sun Yin felt even more strange. Moreover, Sun Yin was extremely arrogant. He publicly announced that the content of his lecture would be a great martial arts demonstration. He would be the attacking party and would have 2 forces in his hands, Beimeng's millions of iron horse cavalry and the remnants of West Chu's restoration of the Guangling Road. Everyone who listened to the lecture belonged to the defending camp. There was the army led by Lu Shengxiang, the commander of the southern expedition, who was newly conferred the title of General Piao Yi by the imperial court. There was also the Liao defense line led by Gu Jiantang, the vassal states forces that participated in the quelling of difficulties. Finally, there was also the Bailiang cavalry that had been deliberately forgotten by the Central Plains for many years. This could be said to be an unprecedented battle of words. Just the number of Imperial College students who participated in the lecture amounted to more than 6,000 people. In fact, most people were destined to not be able to hear what the new chancellor was saying. However, there was no need to worry. Very soon, there would be people from the front to the back to pass on the message, layer by layer, like waves after waves. The students who rushed to occupy the seats early all sat on the ground. Those who came later could only stand. Those who came later had to stand on their tiptoes and stretch their necks. After that, they had to stand on benches and chairs. However, in the best position not far from Sun Quangtu at the front, there were many simple but thick praying mats placed there. There were about 30 of them. Those who were qualified to sit on the praying mats were really honorable. Among them, the leader was the first Prime Minister of Liang Imperial Court in 30 years, the head of the Secretariat, Qi Yonglong. On the left side of the head of the Secretariat was Huan Wen, Tantanon, who was in charge of the province. On the right side was the frustrated person who failed to succeed Bai Gua as the Minister of Rights in the change of power, Yao Baifeng, a Master of Science who continued to be in charge of the Imperial College, and Bai Gua, who was transferred from the Minister of Rights to the Ministry of Revenue. There was also a certain member of the imperial family, who was particularly proud of his success in the middle of winter. Yes, it was the Prince of Chai who swaggered into the capital with the help of his good son-in-law. This long martial arts lecture went on from noon to dusk. There was no sign of it ending, but no one left. In fact, there were even a lot of new faces coming in. There was a sea of people. During this time, the Crown Prince, who was in charge of the country, quietly joined in with the Crown Princess. Soon, the old Minister of the Ministry of Personnel and the new Assistant Minister of the Secretariat, Zhao Yuling, broke through the crowd without hiding his identity and joined in. He sat on a newly added praying mat. Compared to Zhao Yuling, the Prime Minister, Yin Mao Chun, who had been promoted from the Chancellor of the Hanlin Academy to the Minister of Personnel, was much more reserved and low-key. He arrived at the Imperial College with a light carriage and stood side by side with Chen Wang, who was young enough to make one's hair stand on end. He couldn't see or hear anything. However, these two could be called important officials of the central government. One was a second-rank official of the external court, and the other was a third-rank official. They stood there for a full 4 hours. Because they stood at the very back and didn't have any retinue to protect them, They also didn't wear purple official robes. On their left and right were ordinary students of the Imperial College who studied hard. No one knew that there were two important officials of the court standing right in front of them. They only thought of them as ordinary Confucians of Great Peace City. The Imperial College continued to be noisy and lively. It became the hot topic of discussion in the capital. The restaurants and tea houses outside the Imperial College were even more crowded, waiting for the results of the debate to be revealed. There were constantly scholars running onto the street to report the real-time situation. Chapter 1325. However, in the almost empty Hanlin Academy, two travel-worn old faces appeared. One was Mr. Yuan, who had been depressed for many years, and the other made the official on duty almost roll his eyes. When the two teachers of the Song family dominated the literary world, the official was praised by everyone, both in front of and behind him, for being a young phoenix of the Song family. Now, not only were the two teachers dead, there was no glory to speak of. Who did not know that the Song family, which had been endlessly glorious, certainly had no chance to make a comeback? A featherless young phoenix was worse than a chicken. Who would be willing to treat Song Kelly, who was demoted to a poor county magistrate, as a scallion? If such a cold stove could still make a comeback, I would eat all the ashes of the stove. This 7th grade Qing Lu official did not put on too much airs. After all, Yuan Piao, Yuan Huangmen, who had gone out to visit his relatives, still had a position in the Hanlin Academy. They would see each other frequently. There was no need for him to lose the merit that he had accumulated over many years for Song Kelly. Yuan Pu, or Yuan Benshi, the master of the Emperor of Liang, sat down in his room. His half-inch-long tongue was naturally unclear. Don't you want to go to the Imperial College? That's the place where your Song family rose. Song Kelly, who had traveled with Mr. Yuan, shook his head and said calmly, "It's useless to revisit the old place." Yuan Benshi was silent for a moment and said slowly, "Chen Wang, Sun Yin, will be your political enemy from now on. They won't lose to you in terms of achievements and knowledge. But they took the initiative to come out in the open. This is your biggest disadvantage, but also your only advantage." Song Kelly nodded. In the dusk, in the yamen of the Zhao family, which was not far from the Hanlin Academy, a tall old man with purple beard and blue eyes walked to the Imperial Street alone. He stood in the middle of the most magnificent and wide street in the world, with his back to the gate of the Imperial City, and looked at the sky in the south. The old man remembered a chance encounter when he was young. At that time, that man was also very young, and at least he wasn't crippled. At that time, he was deliberately forced to stay in the Hanlin Academy by his master, and his best friend was already in charge of the Ministry of War. The other Jinshi of the same year also had a bright future. It was a time when the literati were overwhelmed by the military. 10 years ago, literati were like performers who could only answer to the generals in the imperial court. If it was a few decades ago, the dynasty was full of warring towns and people were divided into territories. Literati couldn't even answer to the generals. If they didn't flatter the right people, or if they flattered well but were misunderstood by the generals, they might be beheaded. In such a dynasty, not to mention the orthodox Great Chu of the Central Plains, even Dongyue, who was willing to be slaves to the Great Chu, was qualified to laugh at the northern neighbor as a group of uncivilized barbarians, not to mention the orthodox Great Chu of the Central Plains. Because of his purple beard and blue eyes, even the barbarians of Liang in the eyes of the Central Plains people had to mock and ridicule him. It was a gloomy day in late autumn when a certain scholar's life was finally getting better. He went to the Ministry of War to ask his friend to open the back door and borrow a map of the two vast territories. When he got the map as he wished, it was raining heavily. He didn't dare to let the rain wet the map, so he had to take shelter under the eaves of the yamen. But the heavy rain didn't stop, so he could only wait patiently. Then he saw a young man arrive with an umbrella and a small wooden chest in his hand. He didn't like this person because he had a strong warrior's aura. Judging from his attire, he was probably a military officer with a surplus rank who the imperial court turned a blind eye to. The Ministry of War's yamen courtyard was deep and had several entrances. He guessed that this person would be stopped at the first courtyard. As expected, the guy was stopped at the first courtyard, so he didn't pay much attention to him. But when he was waiting for the rain, he occasionally turned his head and glanced at him. He saw the ordinary-looking young warrior standing alone in the heavy rain, his umbrella by his feet. There was also the open chest, shining with white light, which should be silver. But this little bit of silver was nothing in the eyes of the old master of the Ministry of War, whose appetite could swallow the sky. It was just a matter of drinking with 3 or 4 colleagues. He vaguely heard the words of the young man who was refused entry, which were repeated over and over again. I, Su Xiao, promise you with my head. Just give me 1,000 soldiers a month. Just 1 month, the next time I visit you, I will have someone bring 10 chests of gold. The rain continued to fall. He heard the young man in the courtyard speak loudly and compromise constantly. From 1,000 soldiers, it was reduced to 800, then to 500. And the chest also increased from 10 chests to 20 chests, then to 30 chests. When the rain finally lessened, perhaps because the old men of the Ministry of War who were leisurely drinking tea and chatting felt that it was about time to go home, there were groups of 2 or 3 important people who walked out of the courtyard one after another. They chatted and laughed, not looking sideways as they brushed past the young man. Later, a manager finally took a look, but not at the young man who was asking for soldiers and horses. Instead, he looked at the silver soaked in rainwater in the chest. He let out a snort of laughter and seemed to say something sarcastic, but at the time, he was hiding from the crowd at the door and did not hear it clearly. He thought that since the rain hadn't completely stopped, he might as well wait for his friends in the courtyard to finish their business. Perhaps it was true that there was always a way out. He saw an old man wearing a tiger and leopard patch walking out of the courtyard with his hands behind his back. Beside him was an official from the Ministry of War, who was eagerly holding an umbrella. The umbrella was tilted towards the old man. When the old man passed by the young man, he stopped and kicked the chest with his foot. Because the rain was much lighter, he could clearly hear the conversation between the two of them. Where are you from? This general is Su Xiao, from Jinzhou of Liaodong. You lost the battle? Yes. But this general has 700 brothers and defeated 2 of Hong Qingqiu's main battalions, one of which was cavalry. What main force? What cavalry? It's all nonsense. A loss is a loss. This official will only ask you one thing. This official will treat it as a small gamble for fun and give you some men. But can you really earn back your losses? Yes. Well, fine. This official will give you a tiger tally. You can go to the right guard and transfer 300 men. As for the chests, by the way, how many did you say you carried? Sir, it's 30. 30? 50. Oh, you're quite smart. Fine, this official will give you 300 men. Remember to bring the chests directly to my residence later. Thank you, sir. This general will live up to your kindness. Oh, I almost forgot. What's your name? This official doesn't want to not know who to look for when I want to kill someone. Su Xiao of the Jinzhou Battalion. Finally, the big boss from the Ministry of War walked out of the Yamen gate. Beside him was the official who held the umbrella for him with one hand and carried the chest with the other. He saw the young general standing in the rain with his fists clenched. His back was straight, but there was an extra tiger tally in his hand. The young man put the tiger tally into his pocket, bent down to pick up the umbrella, and turned to walk to the gate. He had already looked away when the young general picked up the umbrella. He looked down and faced the south. The latter didn't rush to open the umbrella. Instead, he stopped under the eaves of the gate and seemed to see him. He took the initiative to ask with a smile, "Are you still waiting for the rain to stop?" He stared blankly for a moment, then nodded. Then that fellow grinned at him and threw the umbrella over without giving him a chance to refuse. He walked down the steps in large strides, stepped into the mud, and gradually walked away. That day, Zhang Julu remembered the name of that young warrior. Su Xiao. That year, the era name of Eternal Hui hadn't been used. Of the 2 young men he met, one wasn't the powerful Grand Secretary of the Imperial Court, and the other wasn't a great general with unconferred merits. Nor were they political enemies who had no dealings with him. At the end of the first year of Auspicious Talisman, only Zhang Julu, an old man, was left. The old man standing on the Imperial Road slowly came to his senses. He smiled and muttered to himself, "I don't like to drink. If I can meet you underground, I'll have to buy you a drink. But before that, let me hold the umbrella for Bailiang. Not for you, Su Xiao, but for the people of Bailiang and Liang." At the end of the auspicious year, Emperor Zhao Tuan returned to the capital. The Imperial Censorate and the 6 departments jointly impeached one person. Grand Secretary Zhang Julu of Liang issued an edict and the Imperial Court announced the 10 great crimes. The Emperor issued an edict to execute 9 generations. Chapter 1326. In Xiangzhou, where Guangling Road and Nanjiang Road intersected, it was famous because of a relatively young apricot alley. On both sides of this alley were courtyards in Jiangnan. Although they were not grand, they were exquisite. The residents were not high-ranking officials or dignitaries, but scholars who had fallen on hard times and did not participate in Hong Jia's escape to the north. There were survivors of West Chu who lived in seclusion, and there were also disheartened teachers from Shangyin Academy. When these scholars settled down, they were really short of money and could not build any large residences. The mansion of the Fan family was located in the deepest part of Apricot Alley. The Fan family was once a wealthy family in the southern Tang. The ancestors of this branch of the Fan family did not want any treasures when they separated from the family before they fled. They only wanted the library that was the hardest to carry around. In the past 20 years, they had been struggling to make ends meet. If they did not rely on selling the ancient books in the new building, they would have been reduced to a situation where they did not have enough food to eat. Liang was prosperous, the country was prosperous, and so was the chess. Fortunately, the Fan family produced a chess addict who did not like fame. Fan Zhongho, and Liang Imperial Court's Tanhua Wu Tsongxian, were known as the first two ninth. Before the two were 30 years old, they were invincible south of the Guangling River, especially Tanhua Wu Tsongxian, who later became one of the 8 talents of the capital. After passing the imperial examination, he was personally appointed by the emperor to fight against the 4 great national players of Liang. He won all 4 battles and obtained an incredible record. Fan Zhongho, who had a slight advantage in the battle of first and second, was vaguely the number 1 player in Liang's chess world and received the new title of Fan Ten Dan. The Apricot Alley, where Fan Zhongho lived, was bustling with carriages and horses. However, this chess addict had been refusing visitors. Fan Zhongho, who was gentle and generous on the chessboard, seemed to be particularly unapproachable in real life. The Fan family's library was in the Relief Heart and Begging for Forgiveness pavilions. The Begging for Forgiveness pavilions had 3 floors on the top of the mountain, with 6 rooms each. There were corridors in the front and back, and in front of the building was a square patio. It covered an area of 3 mu and was paved with green bricks. Not long ago, Fan Zhongho, who had just become the head of the Fan family, set a number of strict rules for the collection of books. Among them, there was a rule that no books could be collected from the cabinet. Women with different surnames and surnames were not allowed to enter the cabinet. The keys to the cabinet were controlled by the first son of the family. Today was a warm winter day, suitable for drying books to get rid of mold and dampness. An elegant-looking man in a green robe took out handfuls of printed books from the attic and spread them out on the green brick floor of the courtyard in front of the Seeking Forgiveness pavilion. He did it himself and did not let the servants do it for him. A young girl whose cheeks were flushed red from the sun was squatting on the ground, casually flipping through the books. She wasn't reading with great interest, but was frowning. Looking at her back, the man smiled and stretched. He caught a glimpse of a huge figure sitting on the edge of the patio, where sunlight and shadows intersected, silently. The man's happy mood was clouded. The way this tall giant had visited the Fan family was extremely shocking. He hadn't presented a name card or knocked on the door. Instead, he had fallen from the sky and smashed into the pond in the Fan family's backyard. At the time, Fan Zhongho had been playing chess with someone and had sunk into a long and exhausting thought. The person playing chess had him bring the visitor. Fan Zhongho ordered the servants in the family who heard the noise not to make a sound. Then, this tall and burly man, like a celestial being, had been inseparable from the old and the young, never speaking. It was Fan Sherdwan. The man walked to the old man's side. The old man was sitting on a small stool. In front of him was a gold-threaded Nanmu chessboard. At his hand was a small cup of white salt, a plate of crisp white radishes, and a bowl of white rice. After the tall golden-skinned guest had appeared, the old man had laid out the game in front of him. Then he hadn't placed a piece, saying nothing. Unless the young girl spoke to the old man, even if Fan Zhongho said something, the old man would be too lazy to respond. Fan Zhongho was standing behind the old man. Facing the chess game that had already been set up, his heart was full of suspicion. The black and white chess pieces crisscrossed like canine teeth. This was a classic game of strength. It didn't pay much attention to the shape of the game, but in Fan Zhongho's view, this game was far from worthy of the old man's attention. It had to be known that in the eyes of the world, Fan Zhongho had learned without a teacher, and it was publicly acknowledged that he was slow. In terms of talent, He was worlds apart from Wu Zongxian, who had made his name at a young age. It was only through his tenacity that he had been able to become a late bloomer. A few years ago, he had finally been able to match Wu Zongxian. But of course, Fan Chongho had a master, and it was Huang Longshe of the spring and autumn chess armor. If not for this, Fan Chongho's late bloomer would have been 20 years later. In today's world, the 9th Dan was the highest level of Go. The top national players who were by the emperor's side waiting for the imperial decree were all unquestionably strong 9th Dan. There were also some experts in the countryside who possessed the strength of 9th Dan, but they weren't necessarily strong. As for the princess of Bailiang, Su Weisheng, who had become famous for her studies at the Yin Academy, there was a saying called Su Shi and 13. Su Shi said that this woman's strength was far beyond a 9th Dan expert, and she was fully deserving of the title of Great 10th Dan. Su Shi-san said that she was often able to play the unfathomable and marvelous moves of the 13th Dan. Therefore, she could be considered a first-rate Go master on the same level as Chao Guanzi of West Chu. Fan Chongho admitted that he could barely bear the title of 10th Dan, but when compared to Su Weisheng and Chao Chongqing, there was a huge gap of 1 stone. As for comparing himself to this master in front of him, this was a pleasant reunion between master and disciple. His master had given him 2 stones, but Fan Chongho still lost all 10 games. The old man stared at the chessboard. He picked up a pinch of salt and sprinkled it on the radish. He asked, "Yuetian, do you still remember what I said to you when we played our first game of chess?" Fan Zhongho, who was known by the courtesy name of Yuetian, replied respectfully, "Master said 2 things. One was that true skill lies outside of chess. The other was that no matter how good you are at chess, it's all there is to it. There is a world of difference between knowing how to play chess and knowing how to behave." Huang Longshe, the #1 devil of the spring and autumn period, grunted in agreement. He chewed on the bland and slightly salty radish. "That's why, other than teaching you how to play chess, I also want you to not delay your studies. Now that Wu Zongxian has become famous in the capital, you don't have to fight for anything. Instead, you're even more famous than Wu Zongxian. In the future, no matter who sits on the dragon throne in the Liang imperial court, there will be a place for you." Fan Zhongho asked softly, "Why does master want me to be on good terms with His Royal Highness, the King of Yanqi? Is it because the emperor killed Grand Secretary Zhang Julu and was disappointed?" Huang Longshe smiled and asked, "Yuetian, don't tell me you think Bai Yan shouldn't have been killed?" Fan Zhongho didn't dare to be mysterious in front of his master. He said frankly, even if the emperor wanted to pave the way for Crown Prince Zhao Zhuan, killing Zhang Julu alone would be enough. Killing all 9 of his family members would be too much. Huang Longshe smiled and said, "Let's not talk about the importance of the matter. First, tell me why Bai Yan was a dead end." Fan Zhongho walked to the opposite side of the chessboard and sat upright. He said in a deep voice, "Grand Secretary Zhang Julu promoted the imperial examination and opened the dragon gate for the poor children. Moreover, under Zhang Julu's protection, people like Yin Maochun and Zhao Yuling appeared. Not only were they capable officials, but under the protection of Zhang Julu, they were able to smoothly soak in the officialdom for many years. They became more familiar with the emperor's thoughts and the rules of the imperial court. They knew how to protect themselves and also knew how to accumulate power while leaving their names in the annals of history. These officials were different from those loyal officials in the spring and autumn period, who were willing to die if the emperor wanted them to. Even if the emperor wanted them to die, the officials didn't have to die, but they weren't willing to commit suicide. In the future, there would be a continuous stream of poor and important officials. Since they were born in the marketplace, it didn't matter if they lost the family property they had accumulated over decades. At certain moments, they weren't like the deep-rooted children of the aristocratic families. They were more willing to sacrifice themselves. Zhang Julu was the creator of the Spring of Yonghui and the instigator of the poor people wearing purple and yellow. This is death. Huang Longshe grabbed a handful of white rice and stuffed it into his mouth. He smiled slowly and said, "It's far from enough. The Crown Prince Zhao Zhuan is going to ascend the throne. If nothing unexpected happens, he will be an emperor in a time of peace and prosperity. He won't have any military exploits. But if the imperial court has Zhang Julu for civil affairs and Gu Jiantang for military affairs, it will be extremely difficult for the new emperor, Zhao Zhuan, to convince the masses. The current Son of Heaven has continuously tested the Grand Secretary Darren, Jean Lanting's impeachment, the great General Yang Shenqing's mentioning of the loyal lie of Ji Zhou's Han family, making an exception to promote Chai Juan-Wang's son-in-law Chen Wang, summoning Qi Yanglong to the capital, reactivating the Hall Secretariat's subordinate provinces to contend with the Minister of Shangshu. Various methods have been pressing on the Grand Secretary step by step. Zhang Julu seems to have chosen to retreat step by step from the beginning to the end, dismantling Zhao Yuling's power on his own, abandoning one after another Zhao Yuling, Yin Maochun, and Bai Gua, leaving behind only Wang Xiongui, who was publicly recognized as the most lacking of the Prime Minister's support. Even when the last pillar of Zhang Lu, the Minister of Revenue, Wang Xiongui, was demoted to Guangling's magistrate and left the capital, Zhang Julu still didn't make a sound. Speaking to this point, Fan Zhongho paused for a moment. But as long as Zhang Julu doesn't die, even if he takes the blame and resigns, this civil official leader will return to his hometown and live in seclusion in the mountains after losing his position. Then Grand Chancellor Qi Yanglong, who was originally used to contend with Zhang Julu, will be in an awkward position. Moreover, how old is Zhang Julu, and how old is Qi Yanglong? When the time comes, as soon as the world situation changes, Zhang Julu, who is not in the imperial court but in Jianghu, will instead have the opportunity to become the savior of the world. Today, the disparity in treatment between Zhang Julu and Qi Yanglong, as well as their positions in the hearts of the people, will coincidentally be reversed when the time comes. How can His Majesty not understand the logic within? How can he leave a mess for the Crown Prince? If it's just this argument, without the first death of Zhang Julu as I said earlier, it can still be used as a check and balance for the monarch to control his subjects. However, since it will be a dynasty without major wars in the future, and there will be more and more talented people in the imperial court, the Emperor's Spring of Auspicious Talisman is not inferior to Zhang Julu's Spring of Eternal Hui. Why should the Zhao family keep you, Zhang Julu, around? Huang Longsher nodded. Zhang Julu has been a timely help in these 20 years, so he can't be killed. In the future, he can only be the icing on the cake. His tail can't be removed, so he can indeed be killed earlier. This is also considered death. 2 of them are dead. Continue. Chapter 1327. Obviously Fan Zhongho had a card up his sleeve. He had already prepared a bellyful of drafts, without any pause to ponder. He spoke tirelessly. The previous 2 deaths were the current Son of Heaven's funeral matters. Right now Liang Meng's war and pacification of Guangling are the most urgent matters at hand. During his lifetime, Zhang Julu made enemies on all sides. 3 of his mortal enemies were the imperial family's nobles, the influential family's civil officials, and the local military generals. These 3 had been suppressing their monstrous resentment toward the Grand Secretary Darren. For the past 20 years, the imperial family's clansmen had lived like rats on the street. At first, they originally thought that when the late Emperor Zhao of Liang unified the world, they were all meritorious officials. Plus they were surnamed Zhao, so naturally they could share the country with the emperor. Unexpectedly, Su Xiao and Zhang Julu, 2 people, 1 civil, 1 military, took all the credit. How could they bear it? With Zhang Julu, this roadblock, standing in the imperial court for 1 day, how could those aristocratic families' officials have the chance to stand out among their peers 1 day? The more selfless Zhang Julu was, the more difficult it was for this group of people to obtain benefits for their clans. At that time Zhang Julu wanted to make a bold and decisive move to control the officials, the salt administration, and the transport of grain, 3 things, bumping into each other. The old Shangshu of the Ministry of Works did not hesitate to offend the Grand Secretary Darren to stand up for him and obstruct him from within. Who did the old Shangshu stand up for? Naturally it was for the civil officials of this large group of clans who were entrenched in the local areas. The struggle between civil and military officials is the usual practice of the previous dynasties. Zhang Julu could rely on his skill to settle the arrogance of the party and government, but using Guangling's Jing Nan's overt plot, seizing the opportunity to continuously weaken the vassals and suppress the military, Yan Zhenchuan, Yang Shenqing, several major vassal kings, all became chess pieces whose strength was damaged. Those generals who held military power in their hands could not bear it. The emperor killed the evil man Zhang Julu, letting the 3 factions vent their resentment. It could be said to be killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Afterwards, the new Son of Heaven appeased the people. It could be said to be killing 3 birds with 1 stone. Huang Longsher's expression was calm as he said, "This is also death. But there's one thing you didn't tell me. The reason for this death is that if Zhang Julu is removed from office when he's at the peak of his power, then the three enemies of Zhang Julu who have been holding grudges against him for a long time can be considered to have vented most of their resentment. Anger is easy to vent but difficult to gather. In the future, if they want to fight with Green Eyes again, it will be difficult for them to have the determination to fight to the death. If they fight with Green Eyes with this mentality, even if they have the support of the new emperor, they will still be easily defeated by Zhang Julu, and the Green Party will be divided and conquered. Fan Zhongho said solemnly, "This disciple understands." Huang Longshe reached out to grab the few remaining radishes. He glanced at his disciple who had won the title of Buddha in the chess world and asked, "That's it? Compared to your Xiao Shidi in Xiongfan City, the difference is too great." Fan Zhongho smiled and said, "It's one thing for Zhang Julu not to form his own clique and cut off his own wings, but he also deliberately parted ways with his biggest helper, Tantanon, completely reducing himself to a loner. If not for this, how could those ignorant scholars have the guts to throw the letter of accusation in front of Zhang Julu's door and fish for compliments?" This scene was exactly the same as when a scholar with a scholarly title had to scold Su Xiao for being a butcher. If Huan Wen stood firmly by the Grand Secretary's side, forget about this group of hot-blooded scholars. Even Jin Sanlang wouldn't have this kind of boldness. Without Huan Wen, Zhang Julu will die again. Huang Longshe declined to comment. He only changed the topic. Squinting his eyes, he looked at the salt in the bowl of rice, and said with a laugh, "A famous scholar's romantic life is full of anecdotes. These anecdotes circulating among the imperial court and the common people are just like the scholar's salt. Just eating plain white rice is tasteless, you won't die, but you lack that kind of essence, qi and spirit." Earlier, when Liang was located in a remote corner, where the military town stood in great numbers, all day long the scholars were bullied by the martial artists until they were half dead. Naturally there was not even a fart of anecdotes. By Yen, it was indeed extraordinary. In just one short Yonghui, there was already the Hanlin Academy's guard at the Yellow Gate who fell asleep drunk. The Son of Heaven personally draped a fur coat over her. Tantanon was warming wine in the forbidden area, discussing the world with a pot of wine. That's why I say, although the scholars of the world still have their knees bent, their waists can finally straighten. Fan Zhongho raised his head and glanced at the books sprinkled by the sunlight, sighing with emotion. The memory of a stray dog wandering from place to place when I was a child is still fresh in my mind. Those generals stationed at the checkpoint only recognized gold and silver, making things difficult for me everywhere is one thing. But what I found most difficult to let go of was when they used their spears to lift up the book chests. The chests full of books, the lifeblood of scholars, were scattered all over the ground, wantonly trampled on. I think a world where books can safely bask in the sun is a good world for us scholars. After sighing with emotion, Fan Zhongho took a deep breath and said, "Zhang Julu cheated in the imperial examination, his eldest son embezzled fertile land, and the local clans and people fought over benefits. The evidence of his crimes is conclusive." Speaking to this point, Fan Zhongho laughed bitterly and said, "What a funny evidence of his crimes is conclusive. The latter too should be true, but if you say that Zhang Julu leaked the exam questions, I'm afraid everyone would find it absurd. Regardless of what the truth is, together with the Han family tragedy that implicated the old Grand Secretary, this is another death." Fan Zhongho's hands clenched into fists and rested on his knees, vaguely a bit angry. "If that's all, then that's that, but among the 10 great crimes, there's actually the matter of colluding with the border army." "Colluding with who?" "Tilting half the country's taxes to build the Eastern Front to resist Bei Meng. That was the outline of the country established by the late emperor." "What crime did Zhang Julu commit?" Huang Longshe shook his head and said, "This crime is the most cryptic. You guessed wrong. This crime isn't about Gu Zhentang, it's about Beiliang. Of course, there was also the intention of knocking down Gu Zhentang's hundreds of thousands of border soldiers in passing. After Zhang Julu took power, it seemed like he was advancing step by step, doing his utmost to suppress Beiliang's Su family, but in reality, that was all on the surface. The benefits that Beiliang's border army should have obtained didn't decrease. If it was someone else who became the Grand Secretary, the imperial court might be in a foul mood, but at the very least, Beiliang's side would suffer even more. This is Zhang Julu using the loss of the relationship between ruler and subject as the price, exchanging for a hidden stability for the dynasty's northwest. This of course is death." Fan Zhongho was stunned. He then stood up, facing the north. He gave a heavy bow of respect. Chapter 1328. Huang Longshe sneered. "Do you feel more and more that Bai Yan didn't deserve to die?" Don't be fooled by the fact that there are countless people secretly clapping and cheering for the chief minister's downfall. In fact, the truly discerning people, especially scholars like you who sincerely believe that the people are more important than the monarch, are all gritting their teeth in silence. Do you think that just because everyone seemed to be cursing lame Su at that time, everyone really hated Bailiang? Bai Yan, Tantanon, Gu Jiantang, Yan Zhenchuan, Lu Baijia, Lu Shengxiang, and Su Gong and so on. Do you really only hate them and not respect them? You must know that at that time, Su Shao led Bailiang's personal cavalry to the south, leading Gu Jiantang's direct subordinate General Kai Nan to intercept the Su Fengnian at the border. A total of 60,000 men and horses, when faced with that old cripple, let alone fighting him, they directly knelt down and said, "This general greets the king of Bailiang," clearly in the ears of many officers and soldiers. Not only did he, who was entrusted with high hopes by the imperial court to reduce Bailiang's living space, but the 60,000 armored soldiers all had the same thought. They regarded seeing great General Su Shao from afar as the greatest glory of their lives. In the end, it was Su Shao who replaced Gu Jiantang to inspect the Gu family's armored cavalry. The civil officials in the imperial court were indignant in private, but the generals and soldiers all over Liang didn't feel that there was anything shameful about it. Su Shao is so domineering. He deserves it. Zhang Julu has a scholar like you silently in his heart, and Bai Yan also deserves it. Therefore, this is Bai Yan's death again. Huang Longshe expressionlessly picked up a chess piece from the chess box and said softly, "Crown Prince Zhao Zhuan doesn't have a good impression of this chief assistant. He once tried to befriend Zhang Julu's youngest son, Zhang Bianguan, but to no avail. In times of chaos, military generals were nurtured, while in times of peace, civil officials were valued. This person was destined to be a literati emperor, but in order to balance the civil and military, he had to continue the chess game left by the late Emperor Zhao Dun, where the three provinces of the Hall of Governmental Affairs kept each other in check. There would be more cabinet ministers than the current one, but there definitely couldn't be a civil official leader. Zhao Zhuan needs to sit firmly on the dragon throne, and Zhang Julu will die." Zhang Julu saw things further than anyone else. He ruined his own reputation and left no way out, warning the future generations. Bai Yan was very clear that in the future, the pattern of the literati ruling the country would be formed. The etiquette of not being punished by a doctor would be repeatedly mentioned by the civil officials. Since the first year of Yong Hui, the Hall of Governmental Affairs has been the dominant power. Not to mention the 6 ministers, even the assistant ministers have not been beheaded. If the current trend continues, it will be even more difficult to kill a literati official in the future. There is a very interesting development in this, and that is the greed of the imperial family and the children of the powerful clans. They more or less pay attention to table manners, but the civil officials who were born poor, after shaking off the mud on their bodies, they become even more shameless and their methods are even more secretive. Bai Yan was obviously well aware of this, so this death was his own request. But in my opinion, the death of a chief assistant is really not very useful to the future generations who are deteriorating with each passing day. But it is precisely because of this that I, Huang Longshe, admire Zhang Julu's death the most. The Emperor Zhao Dun wanted him dead. Zhang Julu was willing to die, and he died again. This death is the most helpless of the scholars in the imperial family, but it is also the most romantic of the scholars who have a clear conscience. Huang Longshe, who had been holding the chessboard with 2 fingers from beginning to end, no longer said anything. The salt, rice and radish had long been eaten clean. Fan Zhongho said softly, "Zhang Julu has a 90% chance of dying." Huang Longshe lowered his head to look at the chessboard and asked with a smile, "They all say there is a 90% chance of dying. Do you think Bai Yan still has a slim chance of survival?" Fan Zhongho shook his head. "Everyone wants him dead, but he doesn't want to live. How can he live?" Huang Longshe knocked the white chess piece on the northeast chessboard and even rearranged its position. Fan Zhongho was very surprised. When his master played chess with him, he always placed his chess pieces as if they were flying, not to mention deliberately rearranging the positions of the chess pieces that had already been placed. This was because Huang Longshe had said that once a chess piece was placed, it would take root. The world had always been so ruthless. Even if there were longevity pills in the world, there was no medicine for regret. This made Fan Zhongho, who had lost interest in the chessboard, curious again. He looked carefully. While he was focused on finding the answer, Huang Longshe bent down and grabbed a black chess piece from the box. He looked at the west side of the chessboard and drew a circle there with 2 fingers holding the chess piece. He said indifferently, "Previously you saw me arrange this chessboard in one go. Don't be fooled by the fact that there seems to be a fierce battle here, where the black and white sides are killing each other with great strength. In fact, it is very laughable and may not affect the overall situation." Sitting opposite Huang Longshi, Fan Zhongho's heart skipped a beat. He looked down at the chessboard and asked, "This is the confrontation between Li Yang and Bai Mang." "This is Bai Liang? Bai Liang has 300,000 steel cavalry. How can it not affect the overall situation? Master, I really can't figure it out. Can you help me clear up my confusion?" Huang Longshi threw the black chess piece back into the box and said with a smile, "How can someone like you, Fan Sherdan, guess the next step of Bai Mang's peace decree? Don't waste your brain. You won't be able to figure it out even if you were given 100 years. To be able to play chess with your skill is more or less enough. In the future, just think about how to fight for scholarly honors in the new dynasty. The higher one's chess skill, the weaker one's character." Fan Zhongho carefully glanced at his master. Huang Longshi said with a smile, "I'm talking about you ordinary people. Master and that Bai Mang imperial tutor are not among them." Fan Zhongho asked, "Then what about West Chu's Chao Chongqing?" Huang Longshi said with a smile, "Half and half. Knowing what can't be done yet doing it, he's just a fool. Chao Chongqing's entire second half of his life has been fighting for a single breath. It's meaningless." A laugh came from the distance. It seemed to be mocking this old man for bragging and pointing out the world. Huang Longshi was somewhat embarrassed. Fan Zhongho, seeing his master deflated, wanted to laugh, but didn't dare. Huang Longshi stood up and walked over to the little girl who was still flipping through the book. He rubbed her head and sighed with heartache. "Daughter, don't find trouble with that bronze man in the future. You can't kill him." The old man picked up a book and walked over to the Bai Mang bronze man grandmaster who had been thrown to the Guangling Road by Qi Xuanzhen. But he was quickly squeezed between the two by Miss Hehe. Huang Longshi had no choice but to move his butt to the side. He stretched out his hand and placed it on the book, feeling the warmth of the sunlight. He said, "When I was young, I went to visit Qi Xuanzhen on the demon execution platform. That great spiritual master said, writing a book with a brush is not as good as the cool breeze flipping through the book." I, Huang Longshi, didn't believe and didn't agree. Otherwise, this trip would have been in vain. The bronze man grandmaster didn't say a word. Huang Longshi turned his head and asked, "How much longer?" The bronze man grandmaster still looked straight ahead with lifeless eyes. This side of the courtyard of the begging for forgiveness pavilion returned to silence. Day after day, the whole world finally knew that the current Grand Secretary Zhang Julu had died in prison. At that time, the world remembered an old bastard who deserved to die but didn't die. It seemed that a long time ago, he had given the Grand Secretary, who was at the peak of his power, an unlucky prophecy. Sad New Year's Eve. At that time, everyone suddenly realized that all of the great demon Huang Sanjia's assertions had come true one by one. New Year's Eve, the end of the moon and the end of the year, so it was connected to the end of the new year. The old year was thus removed, and a new year was exchanged. On New Year's Eve of the first year of auspicious talisman, everyone in Apricot Alley, regardless of age, was burning lanterns to welcome the new year. The Fan family was the same. In front of the relaxing pavilion, the bronze man grandmaster stood in the middle of the courtyard, looking up at the sky. The little girl and Fan Zhongho sat on the stone steps. The little girl's face. Fan Zhongho, on the other hand, was like a child, sobbing with his head lowered. During the day, for the first time, his master patiently told him a lot of things, a lot of reasons. He told him about the plans and arrangements of several great advisors who were still alive. He told him about the strengths and weaknesses of Li Yang's crown prince Zhao Zhuan and Yan Qi's heir apparent Zhao Zhuan. He told him how he should coordinate with his little martial brother Lu Su, how he should rise above the others in the bloody struggle between several great powers. He even told him how to succeed and retire. Finally, his master told him a very inexplicable sentence, just like the conclusion that the history books of later generations gave him: Fan Zhongho. Fan Zhongho loved fame, was good at politics, had brilliant literary talent, was cruel on the inside but gentle on the outside. He was one of the 6 ministers of Li Yang's resurgence. In the pavilion, the old man who occupied the top 3 positions of spring and autumn held an oil lamp in his hand, quietly walking between the bookshelves. The wick of the lamp gradually burned shorter and shorter. As the new year approached, the wick of the lamp became shorter and shorter. The flame of the lamp flickered and was about to be extinguished. Huang Longshi walked to the window and looked at the night sky. With a carefree smile he murmured, "I am very happy to meet you all. Yi Baikue, Su Xiao, Zhang Julu, Yuan Benqi, Li Shan, Zhao Chongling, Gu Zhentang, Nailin Yusi, Huan Wen, Qi Yonglong, Chao Chongqing, Li Xiaoxin." The old man raised the oil lamp. "To all of you, to spring and autumn, to your golden spears and armored horses, to your free and easy style." The old man opened the window and casually threw the oil lamp out of the window. He roared with laughter. "My life, how magnificent!" Chapter 1329. In the first year of Xiangfu, the situation of the Guangling Road made people's hearts ache while silently criticizing them. Yang Shenqing's troops had been caught in a jar and Yan Zhenchuan's 30,000 elite cavalry had been completely annihilated. Although the ending was bad, they had still fought the West Chu rebels. Compared to this, the hesitation of the Jingnan king's troops made the entire court feel that it was absurd. After the Duke of Huainan Zhao Ying led his army out of the territory, he camped at Mount Hua and did not move. After the Duke of Jinggan Zhao Sun's 6,000 cavalry arrived at Hao Ao Lake, they also did not make any movements. As for the Crown Prince of Yanqi, other than stirring up trouble on his way north, when he really reached the southern part of Guangling Road, he simply disappeared completely. Could it be that this Crown Prince of Huainan Zhao Ying was not aiming for Jingnan at all, but was swaggering over to fatten himself up? But in a few days it would be the end of the second year of the auspicious talisman. The Duke of Huainan's dispatch of troops raised people's spirits. Li Yang's impression of this vassal king, who was known for his weak temperament, greatly changed. In one fell swoop he defeated the east of Huashan, the yellow goat, the small fish, and the hatred, these three obstacles. Song Wuyang, the general of Huangyang Pass, had joined the rebellion. He raised the Jiang flag in the pass. However, King of Huainan, Zhao Ying, led his army 1 mile away from the pass and asked Song Wuyang to surrender. Song Wuyang was ordered to be shot by the crossbow, but Wang Zhen suddenly killed him. Wang Zhen then opened the gate to welcome Zhao Ying's army. King of Huainan sent Wang Zhen's 3,000 men as the vanguard to attack Small Fish Pass. Ji Yun, the general of Huainan, refused to surrender. Zhao Ying gave the order to attack and personally supervised the battle. Wang Zheng's troops braved the rain of arrows to fill up the trenches and then used ladders to siege the city. After 2 sieges they lost 500 men. Wang Zheng, who personally led the charge, was covered in blood. He requested for a truce, but Zhao Ying did not allow it. He allowed Wang Zheng to watch from the side and ordered his troops to attack the city. At dusk, an endless stream of ballistae, catapults, and battering rams arrived at the battlefield. Both sides fought until night fell, and 800 Huainan soldiers died. Zhao Ying held onto his whip and rode on his horse under the Zhao flag, unmoved. The next morning, they attacked the city again. Zhao Ying's trusted general, Xia Ping, led 80 men to attack the city for the first time. All of them died. Xia Ping's body was stabbed down to the ground by Ji Yun with an iron spear. Wang Zhen angrily asked for a battle. His armor had 6 to 7 arrows embedded in it. He was hit by a huge rock and fell to the ground. When he got up, he was splashed by a pot of boiling oil and fell to the ground. His men risked their lives to carry him back. Zhao Ying, who was wearing the bright yellow royal robe, looked at the fierce battle. His ears were filled with the screams and shouts of killing on the city wall, as well as the beating of the drums beside him. Of course, there was also the sound of the flag with the word, Zhao, fluttering in the cold wind. This man surnamed Zhao, who had always been a target of ridicule in the Liang dynasty, slowly raised his head and looked at the word, Zhao, embroidered on the flag. He pursed his lips, as if he was finally relieved of a heavy burden after so many years. The siege's side had switched to the 4th battering ram. More than half of the huge ballistae, which could reach up to 300 steps away and still had considerable lethality, had been destroyed. The crossbows on the few crossbows at the Small Fishy Pass had long run out of arrows to shoot. They were scattered and had lost their momentum. However, the Small Fishy Pass, which swore to live and die with the city, was still struggling. Its defense was fierce. More than 2,000 spikes that were 5 inches long and weighed 6 ounces, and the 4 sides of the spikes were all broken. The thick ropes of the yakshas and charioteers that could be retrieved by the winches on the city wall were broken. However, There were still brave soldiers on the city wall constantly throwing down sharp iron hooks and long iron chains that formed iron hooks. After they were thrown out, they could hook onto the armor or even the body of the besiegers and hang them in the air like fishing. There were also strangely shaped iron hooks and axes that were used to stab the arms of the besiegers. Zhao Ying, who was slightly closer to the battlefield, saw with his own eyes that a soldier's entire arm was cut off. That arm fell down from the city wall before the soldier. Zhao Ying was indifferent to this, and with an indifferent expression, he turned his horse around. The small fishy pass that was in imminent danger called for help. Ji Yun had no choice but to order the cavalry out of the east gate to seek help from Hen. They agreed that both sides would launch a surprise attack on the Duke of Huainan's camp at dawn. At that time, the small fishy pass would take the initiative to open the gate and charge out with 200 cavalry. Ji Yun would lead the charge, and behind the cavalry would be the remaining 400 men of the small fishy pass. Zhao Ying ordered the experts under his command to lead 10 elite scouts to pursue and kill. Unexpectedly, they still escaped with injuries. The next day, Ji Yun, who knew that the small fishy pass would not be able to be defended, had the heart to die. He and the 200 cavalry appeared at the city gate. Regardless of whether Hen came to help or not, he would fight to the death for Dechu. Ji Yun, who was in the prime of his life, was not someone who did not care about his life, nor was he someone who did not understand the current situation. However, when he was 20 years old, his father, who should have given him the crown, did not appear. There were also no guests to attend the ceremony. He was the one who gave himself the crown. This was because the general of Dechu, Ji Hai, had already died on the battlefield. His 3 uncles had also died on the battlefield. Sitting on the warhorse, Ji Yun ordered his subordinates to open the city gate. He turned around and looked at the faces under the light of the torches. He did not say anything, and just clasped his fist. This day, the general of the West Chu rebel army, Ji Yun, went out of the city at dawn to attack the Duke of Huainan. However, the Zhao Ying's army seemed to have expected this, and formed up in an orderly manner. Out of the 3 passes, Hen Pass, which had the most cavalry, did not care about the order of the Western Front General, Xie Shi, to defend. The 800 cavalry and 2,500 infantry rushed out to help. However, they were attacked by the main force of Zhao Ying, who was waiting for an opportunity. The 800 cavalry in the vanguard suffered heavy casualties under the crossbow fire, and the army collapsed. In the chaos, the main general and deputy general were shot dead by the Duke of Huainan's cavalry, leaving only the old and weak soldiers behind. Hen Pass was earlier than the small fishy pass, and a group of soldiers changed to a large flag with the word Zhao on it. Hen Pass infantry commander led 700 men back to the city and committed suicide. After 3 charges, Ji Yun was killed by an arrow from the Duke of Huainan's general, Ho Datong. It pierced through his head, and he fell off his horse and died. The 200 cavalry and 400 infantry at the small fishy pass all died in the charge. Zhao Ying, who was wearing an eye-catching robe, got off his horse and walked past the corpses. He slowly walked up the city wall and looked at the rising sun in the east. He smiled and said, "The sun shines brightly, and the lambs feel warm." The Duke of Huainan, who had won 3 passes in succession, did not send a single report of victory to Great Peace City. He did not even take over the dangerous pass of Guangling Dao. In reality, after this vassal had won the pass, he had no intention of dividing his forces to digest the fruits of his victory. He only had the heavily injured Wang Zhan and his remaining troops stay at Yellow Goat Pass. After putting up the Zhao flag on the city walls of the 3 passes, he led all the Huainan Dao soldiers to continue east, heading straight for the dangerous and difficult to attack Yaoyu Pass. Between these 2 passes was a rarely seen plain on the west side of Guangling Dao. After the Duke of Huainan reorganized himself at Hen Pass, he brought all the warhorses that could be ridden and slowly advanced. It was as if he was quietly waiting for Dechu to rush to Yaoyu Pass. That genius general who made the entire Liang dynasty remember his name at such a young age, Xie Shibian. On the plains closer to Yaoyu Pass, both sides had enough time to reorganize themselves and scouts. The Duke of Huainan, Zhao Ying, got off his horse and put on an exquisite armor over his robe. He carried a quiver of arrows that he had kept for many years. This Duke of Huainan, who was ridiculed for having great ambition but little talent, was a pitiful person who had been scolded by the emperor many times. This was a man who had no children after his eldest son died, for no reason, at Dan Tong Pass. Jumping onto his horse, Zhao Ying looked straight ahead. He smiled at the two generals that had followed him for many years. Hou Datong, Yu Qianshan, Xia Ping was one step ahead of us. Like the few of us agreed when we were young, we will die on the battlefield. Now it is our turn. After so many years, I've caused you to live such a pitiful life. Hou Datong laughed and said, "It is indeed a pitiful life, but it is a quick death. Later, I will kill a few more West Chu bastards. I guarantee that old Xia will die from anger." Haha, I forgot that this guy is already dead. Yu Qianshan looked more like an elegant strategist waving a feather fan than the boorish Hou Datong. However, he still wore armor and carried a sword. He smiled and said, "You guys are really straightforward. It has been hard on a scholar like me." Before Zhao Ying gave the order to charge, he closed his eyes and said softly, "Father, I am unfilial. I have not had the chance to toast in the imperial mausoleum. Today, I will use blood in place of wine." In front of the Duke of Huainan, Zhao Ying, there were 2,000 heavy armored infantrymen in formation. On the two sides of the infantrymen, there were 1,000 elite cavalry. There were also close to 1,000 cavalry roaming far away, waiting for an opportunity to strike. On this day, except for the 4,000 soldiers and horses that were recruited from all over Huainan, Zhao Ying, Hou Datong and Yu Qianshan, as well as all of his personal guards, were all killed in battle. None of them were killed by an arrow in the back, and none of them were killed by the cavalry roaming behind them. On the same day, the king of Jing and Zhao Sun rushed all the way from Hao Ao Lake after hearing the news. At dusk, he arrived at the periphery of the battlefield. He knew that the situation was hopeless. He knew that there were still 1,000 heavy cavalry at Yaoyu Pass. He saw with his own eyes that the Duke of Huainan's corpse was knocked off his horse by a West Chu general. The young king of Jing and Zhao Sun still decided to lead the charge. Out of the 6,000 Qingzhou cavalry, only 200 were left. They risked their lives to protect Zhao Sun as they fled the battlefield. In this battle, one of the two kings who participated in the war died and the other was injured. Chapter 1330. It was the end of the year, and the victory of the West Chu rebel army at Yaoyu Pass meant that the already thin encirclement was now wide open. For the Liyang imperial court, it was one disaster after another. The former could happily say goodbye to the old and welcome the new, while the latter, after Yan Zhenchuan died in battle, the capital was once again shrouded in a thick layer of haze. Luckily, after Yan Zhenchuan and Yang Shenxing, there was another veteran general who was famous during the spring and autumn period. After a long and honest conversation with Lu Shengxiang, he led his troops down south. 30,000 troops headed straight for Qingyang Basin. They did not seek to defeat West Chu, but to save the 40,000 Jinan infantry that were trapped by Yang Shenxing. Great General Lu Shengxiang, who had been stagnant at Yulu Pass, finally made a move under the gazes of tens of thousands of people. He led his troops down the Yu East Plains toward the south. However, the thing that calmed the hearts of the people the most was not the movement of close to 100,000 troops, but the appearance of two people in Great Peace City. One was the emperor who was imprisoned by the Grand Secretary after returning from patrolling the borders. The other was the great General Gu Zhentang who accompanied the emperor. The emperor who had once punished the Duke of Huainan because of a small matter only gave 2 edicts after returning to Great Peace City. The first one was for Zhang Julu to die miserably without a posthumous title. The second one was for King Zhaoying to die with great honor, with a posthumous title and the words, "If I lose my right-hand man." The end of the year was not easy, but they had to get through it. In Great Peace City, firecrackers celebrated the new year. However, compared to the past, it lacked the festive atmosphere. Just like this, the Liyang Imperial Court welcomed the auspicious second year. It was the first morning court session of the new year. Emperor Zhao Dun sat on the dragon throne. This was the umpteenth time this monarch had sat in the north facing the south since he ascended the throne. Through the wide palace doors, he looked straight at the imperial path that he could see with one glance. The emperor naturally had to listen to the world from the south and rule from the light. Perhaps because he sensed the emperor's absent-mindedness, eunuch Song Tonglu of the ceremony directorate did not call out, "If there is something to report, court is dismissed." The civil and military officials in the imperial court and the officials outside the hall all lowered their heads respectfully, retracted their gazes, and waited quietly with bated breath. The old officials who had suffered greatly from the morning court session all began to doze off without leaving a trace. The emperor slowly pulled back his gaze from the seemingly endless imperial road to the southern border to the palace gates. The emperor could still clearly remember the two generals he had summoned to first destroy the Chu and then pacify Shi Shu. The older one was a cripple. His steps were neither fast nor slow. It was not slow because he was limping. Instead, it was a kind of sloppiness as he walked on a path that an official should take seriously, but he did not take it seriously. This person wore the Su family's knife that shocked the world. As he walked closer step by step, it made the emperor, as the emperor, feel a sense of humiliation and suffocation. The young man behind the cripple had a dignified appearance and was dressed in white. He was really young, making people feel close to him. This was especially true for the new emperor who sat on the throne. He wished he could lower himself and hold his arm and chat with him. In his heart, the new emperor thought that if the previous emperor could have the cripple fight for him in the south and north, then he should also have an even better white-clothed war saint. He could also be like the previous emperor, boldly giving a young general the greatest authority and the greatest number of troops to lead his horse and send him off. He could let him freely go beyond the Great Wall and work together with his officials to establish an unprecedented military service. However, the young man in white had refused. The emperor was disappointed, but he was not angry. Later, the emperor looked at the young scholars who would shine brightly in the future. In the morning light, they walked step by step into his line of sight with unconcealable restraint and excitement. Yin Maochun, Zhao Yuling, Bai Gua, Wang Xiongui, Zhang Zhenxian, Qian Yujian, a dazzling lineup. Together, they created the eternal Hui Spring of the Liang dynasty. And they are destined to go down in history with me for all eternity. In the last court meeting of the eternal Hui dynasty, the two unruly vassal kings, Su Shao and Zhao Bing, were not in the court. However, there were meritorious generals like Gu Jiantang, Yang Xinqing, and Yan Zhenchuan, as well as young and strong generals like Lu Shang and Lu Baijia, who had enough years to accumulate military service. There were civil officials like Zhang Julu, Huan Wen, and Yao Baifeng, who were gradually getting old. There were famous scholars like Yin Maochun, who were in the prime of their lives. There were also those top 3 scholars who seemed to be inexhaustible. The previous emperor had deeply regretted that when he first aspired to rule the world, there were too few people to make ends meet. However, he, Zhao Dun, was different. He truly felt the heroic spirit of sitting on the throne. The emperor retracted his gaze and looked at the door of the hall. That threshold was a very important dragon gate that all the officials in the world wanted to cross. He had seen with his own eyes the old civil officials and generals with embroidered white herons or bears kneeling in the square outside the hall year after year. They looked eagerly at the golden imperial hall that the common people spoke of. They knelt until they were lying in their coffins, but they were still unable to enter. He had also seen many people who wanted to laugh but forced themselves to hold back. Some people fainted from hunger and the sun and were carried away by eunuchs. Some people couldn't hold back their urge to pee and were found to be reprimanded and given demerits. There were even colleagues who had shed all pretense of cordiality one day, and secretly elbowed each other the next day. There were also people who quietly yawned and were discovered by the emperor's sharp eyes. He jokingly called them into the hall to be lectured. He remembered that the guy didn't wait for him to speak. He was so scared that he fell to the ground with a thump. He was a man of 7 feet. He kept kowtowing and crying. He asked him warmly and found out that he had been on duty at the Ministry of Revenue the night before and hadn't slept at all. He allowed him to take a day off. He even smiled and asked the head official of the Ministry of Revenue in the hall if he could approve. At that time, Wang Xiongui and Bai Gua weren't sitting in the position of Minister of Revenue. The old minister, who had always been known for his strictness, joked along, "Once your majesty says so, this official has to approve even if I don't want to." 6 years later, that official of the Ministry of Revenue went to Huainan province and was promoted to a county governor. The old minister had long retired and returned to his hometown. The emperor retracted his gaze again and looked inside the hall. Chapter 1331. West Chu's Grand Preceptor Sun Shiji's chair was gone. This old man should be standing in front of the little girl in the West Chu palace. The emperor didn't hate this old man. In several conversations, the emperor admired the old man's profound knowledge. He even privately said that only the soil and water of West Chu could give the old man such a unique aura. Of course, it was only temporary. The old man also nodded in agreement. Even if this old man went to West Chu, the emperor felt that even if the imperial army pacified Guangling Road in the future, as long as the old man was willing to live, The Liang dynasty should have the magnanimity to let him enjoy his old age. The emperor finally looked at the young man standing with his back to him. He was wearing a yellow robe. It was his son, the crown prince Zhao Zhuan. The emperor wasn't dissatisfied with this son who had been regent for some time. Just looking at him, he couldn't help but feel guilty for his eldest son, Zhao Wu. Therefore, he planned to marry the peerless Chen Yu to Zhao Wu at the border. Leaping over the crown prince's head, the emperor saw a dazzling empty seat. Nearby was the provincial governor, Huan Wen, who had been standing there for some years. There was also the new head of the secretariat, Qi Yonglong. On the other side was the great pillar of the country, Gu Zhentang, who had returned from the two Liao provinces. Only one person was missing. The emperor subconsciously gripped the armrests of the dragon throne. He went to the imperial prison, but he stood far away from it. He stood from late night to early morning, but he didn't go near to meet that person. He was afraid that the purple-bearded and blue-eyed man would be battered and exhausted in prison. He was afraid that he would see the Grand Preceptor's soulless appearance. But what he was truly afraid of was that this scholar Zhang Julu wouldn't be the least bit dispirited. He would only laugh and scold him, Zhao Dun, as a fatuous ruler. The emperor's lips trembled slightly as he quietly let go. Almost at the same time, Song Tonglu said loudly, "If there's anything, please submit a memorial. If there's nothing, the court is dismissed." In the bone-chilling night, a husband and wife walked hand in hand in the silent palace. They walked to the front of a majestic hall, and the man in high spirits turned around to help his wife tighten the knot in front of her chest. Then, he raised his head to look at the top of the hall. He pointed his finger and said softly with a smile, "Treat each other with sincerity, and share the autumn moon together. Congenial spirits, brothers sitting together in the spring breeze." This is the friendship between the late emperor and Su Xiao and Yang Taisui. The man leaned to the side and gently held his wife's hands. He lowered his head and helped her breathe a mouthful of hot air. Then he said, "A real man should fly, how can a woman fall?" These were the words that Zhao Heng blurted out in front of the late emperor when he was 7 years old. Little brother wishes for 4 things to be well: Green Mountain, the library, the beauty, and elder brother. This was what Zhao Yi, that big fat fellow, said. Therefore, the world belongs to me, the elder brother, but I'm willing to give him Guangling Dao. When Zhao Bing was young, he often claimed that he could hear the short sword by the bedside. However, the older he got, the more taciturn he became. I sent him to Nanjiang to fight Bei Mang. He has nothing to do with it. As for Zhao Ying and Zhao Sui, I've never had any feelings for them. However, since Zhao Ying died a worthy death, I won't be stingy. The man looked at his wife whose eyes were red and suddenly smiled. I know, I'm just experiencing terminal lucidity. I don't have much time left. His wife, the mother of the world, Empress Zhao Ji, gently rested her head on his shoulder. However, Zhao Dun, not the emperor, stroked his wife's hair and said softly, "I don't have any regrets in this life. I just feel that I spent too little time with you. It's funny. Perhaps I spent more time dealing with those cabinet ministers and those memorials than I did with you." Zhao Ji suddenly asked, "Do you still remember the trick we played back then? At that time, you were just a prince and I was a prince's wife." Zhao Dun laughed and took a step back. He solemnly bowed and said, "Long live Her Majesty the Empress." Zhao Ji also took a step back. "Long live His Majesty." A moment later, Zhao Dun covered his mouth and coughed incessantly. Zhao Ji gently massaged his back. After Zhao Dun recovered, he held her hand tightly. "Let's go." Zhao Ji made a sound of acknowledgement. She said, "Your Majesty, do you know? I'm very happy to be able to marry you. I'm even happier to be able to grow old with you. I know you've always felt that you're not good-looking enough, but in fact, you can't be any better looking. Look, you already have white hair, but I still can't get tired of looking at you. It's exactly the same as when I first saw you. I liked you so much that I won't dislike you for the rest of my life. So you also know how to say these words of love." Haha. Of course I know how to say words of love. But in the past, I always thought that the best words of love in the world were to walk with you to this day and let you know that I like you more than love at first sight. The woman whose hand was tightly held stopped walking and sobbed. She did not have the demeanor a woman should have as the mother of the world. He also stopped walking and tried to reach out to wipe away her tears. But in the end, he leaned towards her. She hugged him. Even though there were still traces of tears, her gaze was unusually determined. She lowered her voice and said, "It's good that you're gone. You can finally rest in peace. I will help you look after this great country, help you look after Zhuan sitting on the dragon throne." Just 2 years after entering Xiongfu, a great nightmare came. At the beginning of spring in the Liyang dynasty, the entire country was dressed in mourning. Cries could be heard everywhere in the enormous Great Peace City. Then, a young man surnamed Zhao, who had been a prince for more than 20 years and who had only worn the crown prince's robes for 1 year, wore the unique clothing of the dynasty and ruled the world. The young ruler of a country wore a brand new dragon robe that fit him perfectly. He sat high on the chair. When all the civil and military officials were kneeling, he expressionlessly looked into the distance like the previous emperors. At this time, the emperor should have raised his hand and said in a deep voice, "Rise, my subjects." He didn't forget his etiquette. But he was not in a hurry to speak. He narrowed his eyes and admired the kneeling figures inside and outside the hall. If he did not speak, no one could rise. Because from now on, the emperor of Liyang was him, Zhao Zhuan. He glanced in the northwest direction and the corners of his mouth rose imperceptibly. Chapter 1332. In Yanji County at the border of Yuzhou, the Tao family could be called a famous family in the county. The children of the family were well versed in both civil and military affairs in Yuzhou. The Tao family was simple and honest. The head of the Tao family, Tao Jinzhao, had a good reputation. He had built a warehouse for grain and had opened the warehouse many times to provide disaster relief in Yuzhou. When the million-strong army of Bei Mang was bearing down on Beiliang, many large families in Yanji County followed the principle of a cunning rabbit having 3 burrows. They had their young children secretly move out of Beiliang with their property. Only the Tao family did not make any moves. A group of more than a dozen horses rushed to the Tao family's mansion in the middle of the night. In the darkness of the night, the dense horseshoes stepped on the bluestone road with 6 memorial archways bestowed by the imperial court. It was particularly crisp and melodious. Tao Jinzhao, who was over 50 years old, had received a secret report that caught him unprepared. He hurriedly put on his clothes and set out with his entire family. The family of more than 100 people knelt respectfully on the stone steps outside the door. The leader of the group was a young man covered in a thick fur robe. Behind him was a one-armed old man with 2 strands of snow-white eyebrows and a white-clothed woman whose figure was better than that of the northern warriors. The dozen or so retainers behind them all carried short crossbows and cold sabers. They were all white horses. Tao Jinzhao's 2 unmarried granddaughters knelt side by side. They couldn't help but take a peek at the young man who was smiling and helping their grandfather up. He was extremely handsome with a good appearance and an even better temperament. They guessed that he might be a son of a Central Plains aristocratic family, who had risen to power while the scholars were in decline. In the past, they had always heard that the scholars from Jiangnan were handsome and elegant. Every movement of theirs carried the fragrance of books. They were like heaven and earth compared to the local men of Beiliang. Of course they guessed wrong. It was true that scholars from other parts of Beiliang took every opportunity to occupy seats, but other than Yul Wandao and a handful of others, no one had the qualifications to make the head of the Tao family mobilize so many people. The one who made them fall in love with him at first sight was the king of Beiliang, who had led 10 white horses to Yanji County in disguise. Su Fengyan and Tao Jinzhao quickly walked through the main door. They saw a young child in the arms of a woman. The child looked delicate and pretty, so Tao Jinzhao took a jade pendant from her waist and gave it to the child with a warm smile as a greeting gift. Then, Su Fengyan had the old, young and women of the Tao family dispersed to rest, leaving behind only Tao Jinzhao and Tao Wenhai. Without any polite greetings, Su Fengyan lowered his voice and asked straightforwardly, "Have you settled down the last group of spies from Lingzhou?" Tao Jinzhao, whose emotions were surging, calmed down a bit, and then reported, "This group of 26 individuals have already been placed in various places. The 3 groups of people have a total of 81 individuals. Together with the 4 second-level masters and 15 third-level experts that were secretly dispatched from the King Manor to Yanji County, they can coordinate with each other in secret. Everything has been prepared, and we are only waiting for the Northern Mang loyalists who have infiltrated our borders to walk right into our trap. Now that all the passes at the border have been closed, and there are elite crossbowmen and local scouts of Yuzhou roaming around. Even if there are some who slip through the net and cross the line of defense, it will be very difficult for them to enter the hinterland of Yuzhou and assassinate officials." Su Fengyan nodded. Tantai Pingjing, Sui Xiegu, and Bai Ma Yizong naturally wouldn't participate in the secret conversation. Only Su Fengnian and the Tao family's father and son were left in an elegant room. Lush green bamboos could be seen outside the window. At the end of last year, there was heavy snow everywhere in Liang, and Beiliang was even more so. This year's late spring wasn't as cold as before, but Su Fengnian didn't take off his fur coat after sitting down. Tao Jinzhao and Tao Wenhai were also given a seat. However, it was clear that they were very reserved in front of this famous young vassal king, even in their own territory. Instead, they were like shabby guests. The elderly head of the Tao family was in awe, and Tao Wenhai, who was a county magistrate in Yanji County, was in awe over fear. Soon, a graceful woman came in with hot ginger tea. After putting it down, she went to the corner of the room and sat down. She bent down and skillfully opened a drawer and box, placing a dozen kinds of precious spices on a small table made of red sandalwood in front of her. The sandalwood table was previously furnished with a typical master and servant: a bottle, a furnace, and a box. The furnace was the master, and the box was the servant. Su Fengnian held the ginger tea with both hands and took a sip. Immediately, the cold was driven away a bit, and the warmth seeped into his heart and spleen. In this rare moment of leisure, he subconsciously looked at the woman who gave off a quiet and peaceful feeling. She was probably the kind of woman who was said to be delicate and beautiful. Her clothes were appropriate, but her breasts, waist and buttocks, as well as her kneeling legs, all kinds of rounded curves didn't disappear because of the winter clothes. Of course, Su Fengnian didn't have any romantic feelings, and he didn't have any thoughts of doing anything with her. However, such an outstanding woman was pleasing to the eye. Su Fengnian was an expert in the art of appreciation. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he was a grandmaster. Otherwise, Great Peace City would not have been so obsessed with the calligraphy and paintings that Beiliang and His Royal Highness had used seals to call fakes in the early years. Su Fengnian looked over and knew that the brass incense burner came from the famous Nanzhu Huangju. The incense burner was very ancient and had diluted its toughness. After many years of maintenance, it gave off a bright red color like a famous sword that shone with light. If there were no accidents, the ashes in the incense burner would be the remains of agarwood that had been burned for many years. 10 years of burning incense and half a burner of ashes. Su Fengnian's mind wandered absent-mindedly. His gaze stopped near the young woman. Tao Jinzhao smiled knowingly. His oldest granddaughter had been unwilling to marry for so many years, causing him to be mocked by some of his old friends who had failed in marriage, as having a daughter in the Tao family is a rare commodity worth hoarding. Different from his father, who was quick-witted, Tao Wenhai had been secretly observing this king of Beiliang who had turned over a new leaf. Because the Tao family had a hidden identity in the whisk water room, Tao Wenhai had participated in the transmission of military intelligence in Yuzhou very early on. Compared to the other descendants of large Beiliang clans, Tao Wenhai was much more curious about Su Fengnian. Su Fengnian gathered his thoughts and said frankly, "Excuse me." The woman smiled sweetly. Su Fengnian took a big sip of ginger tea, put down the teacup, and said in a deep voice, "According to the intelligence that Chu Lushan dug out from the South Dynasty, the Empress of Beimang has long asked Li Mibi to make a plan to send assassins before the troops and horses move. Beimang's Zhonghu forces are divided into 2 parts. Most of the top masters and all the low-level warriors have joined the army, while the middle-level masters are assigned to Li Mibi, the head of the Beimang spies, to accurately assassinate our border generals and civil officials. They won't go to the Beiliang Protectorate where Chu Lushan is to seek their own deaths. But Tao Wenhai, you are indispensable to the Beiliang and a core official who lacks personal guards, so you are the best target for the men of sacrifice of Beimang." Su Fengnian stretched out his finger and gently turned the teacup. The border to the north of Liangzhou is full of military towns and cities, so it's very difficult for the enemy to find an opportunity. In Yuzhou, it's much more complicated. Although the area around the mouth of the calabash is densely covered with webs of various sizes, their original purpose is to impede the rapid advance of Beimang's army. They don't have the power to deal with these men of sacrifice of Spiderweb and Zhonghu masters. Even though Great General Yan Wenwan and Yuzhou General Huang Fucheng have already sent out 16 elite cavalry units of about 500 men to hunt down the fish that slipped through the net, I believe it's still very difficult for them to succeed. The real battle in Yuzhou will still take place within the border. Therefore, the Peregrine Falcon Eagle Guard in Wutongin and Whiskroom will mainly focus on the border counties like Yanji County. However, even though the Peregrine Falcon Eagle Guard has already sent out all their forces, when the time comes, they are bound to be flustered. Tao Wenhai gently glanced at his father, Tao Jinzhao, who nodded. Only then did Tao Wenhai say, "Your Highness, what this lowly official is most worried about right now is that after Beimang enters the border, Beimang will scatter their troops. Each troop will be led by one or several top masters. Even if we have the Peregrine Falcon Eagle Guard secretly protecting us and sending out a message at the cost of his life before he died, our men of sacrifice in the vicinity will immediately rush to the battlefield to encircle and annihilate them. I'm afraid that the enemy has concealed their strength in the previous attack and has no intention of retreating after succeeding in one strike. At that time, we may instead suffer a second round of heavy casualties. By the time we come to our senses, we will have no choice but to gather several main forces to intercept them. Perhaps the enemy's other top forces will begin to quietly make their move again." At this point, Tao Wenhai seemed to want to say something but hesitated. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "There's no harm in speaking frankly." Tao Wenhai went straight to the point and said, "After all, our Bailiang is only a sparsely populated place. We don't have the upper hand in this kind of battle of attrition of masters. Beimang's Dao De Sect, Chess and Sword Music School, Princess's Grave, and Mount Tibbing have all sent their elites to join the battle. Many famous Beimang Devil Path heroes are also working for Li Mibi. Our side is definitely at a disadvantage in terms of the number of Level 2 and Level 3 martial arts grandmasters. But it's precisely these kinds of people who can make the most decisive impact in the battle of assassination and counter-assassination. Our large number of light cavalry can't perform well. To put it bluntly, we may be led by the nose from the beginning to the end. We may not even be able to catch the corner of their clothes." Su Fengnian nodded and said, "In fact, there are 5 Level 1 masters in Beimang with definite identities. They are the disciplinary elder of the Dao De Sect, the great music school of the Chess and Sword Music School, Little Idea of the Princess's Grave, and 2 famous devils. So this time, the whole history of Beimang's Jianghu has been dug out by His Majesty. Our Yuzhou will be the first touchstone for that old woman to reorganize the Jianghu." Tao Wenhai and Tao Jinzhao looked at each other and saw the deep worry in each other's eyes. Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Of course, the good news is that other than Little Idea of half-face makeup, the rest are only in the Vajra realm and the Finger Mysterious realm. Moreover, most of the Level 2 grandmasters are from the Chess and Sword Music School. Their realms are not low, but when it comes to a life-and-death battle, they may not be comparable to Bailiang's Level 3 martial artists." Chapter 1333. Tao Wenhai smiled wryly. Since the enemy was so strong and difficult to defeat, this didn't seem like good news to be happy about. In the corner, the woman sitting with her knees bent slowly stirred the incense ashes evenly and cut the agarwood into small pieces. The charcoal and the agarwood were filled with a graceful beauty. Because tonight's conversation would definitely not be short, her movements were neither hurried nor slow. Tao Wenhai said carefully, "Your Highness, if I may be so bold as to suggest," Su Fengnian quickly said, "you want the Wu family's cavalry and swords to come to Yuzhou to put out the fire?" Somewhat embarrassed, Tao Wenhai nodded. Su Fengnian shook his head and said, "The Wu family swordsmen have to stay with Chu Lushan in case of any accidents. They can't move yet." Tao Jinzhao and Tao Wenhai knew that the long-browed one-armed old man next to the king of Bailiang was a sword immortal who had become famous in Liangzhou city. Of course, they didn't think that such an expert would leave the king of Bailiang's side. Most importantly, no matter how bad their eyesight was, they could tell that the king of Bailiang was acting very strange. It was as if he had only won a Pyrrhic victory after a great battle. If they guessed right, then the sword-immortal old man couldn't leave without permission. In fact, Su Fengnian hoped that Sui Xiegu could help since Tantai Pingjing was by his side. However, the old man didn't care about the situation in Yuzhou at all. He didn't care about his seniority at all. Wherever Tantai Pingjing went, he would go. The two of them added up to more than 200 years old. In Sui Xiegu's words, "How many times can I look at her now? Of course, I'll look at her as much as I can." However, Su Fengnian wouldn't just wait for death and allow Beimang's forces to strut around Yuzhou. In addition to the mobilization of Wutongen's Whispering Room and Tide Listening Pavilion's experts, he also sent Mi Fengjie, the master of the Heavy Sword Cave, to Yuzhou to cooperate with Fan Xiaochai, the granddaughter of Fan Baoshan, who used to be Northern Han's Defender General. Fan Xiaochai's Finger Xian realm wasn't something that Daozong's Xian realm could compare to. With Fan Xiaochai's current strength, she could easily defeat any second-level master of the Chess and Sword Music School, even if it was 1 against 2. In addition, the Guanyin sect's Qi refinement warriors had already secretly rushed to Yuzhou. They wouldn't directly get involved in this muddy water, but they would do their best to keep an eye on those first-level masters who only appeared briefly during the battle. They would pass on the information to the nearby Peregrine Falcon Eagle Guard so that Yuzhou would have a target to target. This battle would definitely be a series of small-scale and bloody battles. Once the two sides met, they were destined to die or be injured. There was no way to escape unscathed. It was a competition to see which side could move faster and more stealthily. Tao Jinzhao and Tao Wenhai only guessed that the king of Beiliang was seriously injured, but Bei Mang's Li Mibi clearly knew about it. Thus, Suaxia Valley was a target that Bei Mang had to focus on. In Su Fengyan's opinion, other than the princess's grave, Suaxia Valley, who might be a backup plan for an imaginary enemy, there should be another top-notch master hiding even deeper. Of course, the top-notch in Su Fengyan's eyes would not be on the same line as literati like Tao Jinzhao and Tao Wenhai. Su Fengyan asked, "Is there a detailed map of Yozhou's situation here?" Tao Wenhai hurriedly got up and went to the study to fetch the maps. After that, he came back with a large pile of maps, including the map of the territory of Yuzhou province and the maps of prefectures and counties. He spread out the largest map of the entire Yuzhou province on the desk and put the smaller maps separately. Not everyone dared to hide these things among the people. Once the government found out, they would definitely be thrown into jail. Su Fengyan stood up, followed by Tao Jinzhao and Tao Wenhai. Su Fengyan inquired about the distribution of the men of sacrifice in each county of Yuzhou in detail, hoping to fill in the gaps. Naturally, the three of them would occasionally talk about the topography of each county. Tao Wenhai was surprised to find that the king of Vassal knew the geography of Yanji County like the back of his hand, which many locals of Yanji County did not know. He could also casually mention the garrison troops and commanding officers in each county. He even knew the background and character of the generals who were no higher than level 6 or level 7. Tao Wenhai could not help but suspect that he, a small county magistrate, could not escape from the king's eyes. For a moment, he was worried that he would leave a bad impression on the young king. The three of them chatted for 4 hours. The young woman sat in the corner with her legs bent, except for pouring incense, tea and candles. Chapter 1334. Her name was Tao Tonxiang. She wasn't trying to please the king of Beiliang. In fact, she had been paying attention to Su Fengyan for a long time. At that time, he was still the infamous good-for-nothing His Royal Highness. Tao Tonxiang's father, Tao Xianlong, had spent a lot of money to buy a famous painting from Beiliang Palace. It was Ladies of the Dragon Palace, from the Western Shu Kingdom of the previous dynasty. When she saw the two huge fakes, she was stunned. How could there be such a bastard in the world who would waste natural resources so recklessly? Every time these celebrities and refined scholars opened a scroll, they would look at it with a pilgrimage mentality. It would definitely be passed down from generation to generation. As long as it was well preserved, it might even be placed on a table to be admired 500 or even 1,000 years later. Wasn't this guy afraid that he would go down in history because of those 2 words? Later, she was a little angry. As long as it was a painting with His Royal Highness's seal, she would ask her father to buy it back at a high price. It was funny. At that time, Tao Xianlong, who was only a secondary 7th rank official, spent a lot of money to buy fakes. Because of this, the governor of Yanji County, Hong Shandong, who was a righteous official, thought that this person was a talent. Especially when His Royal Highness became the king of Beiliang, Tao Xianlong was promoted again. Over time, Tao Tonxiang collected no less than 30 paintings with Su Fengyan's seal. Not all of them were fakes. For example, Su Fengyan's hastily written calligraphy was privately praised by collectors in the capital for being witty and interesting. There was also a concise and vivid phoenix portrait seal with rough words. The mother-son seal on loquat was even more memorable. So Tao Tonxiang slowly felt that she had known this man for a long time. She knew every news he had received from Liang Lake, from the capital's imperial court, and from Beiliang's officialdom over the years. She gently placed her hands on her knees and raised her head to look at the man who had never been domineering. Every time he frowned and every time he smiled warmly, she would carefully observe it as if she was collecting a treasure. After another 2 hours, Su Fengyan smiled and let the old Tao Jinzhao go to bed first. He continued to chat with Tao Wenhai by the light. Their topics were broader, and they were no longer limited to Yuzhou or even Beiliang. Instead, They included the politics and military of Liang and Bei Meng, as well as the local customs of the two dynasties. When the Tao family patriarch left, he went to his granddaughter, Tao Yanxiang, and asked her to make tea and prepare some pastries. Therefore, when they moved to the couch by the window to chat, she sat between the king of Beiliang and Uncle Tao Wenhai. It was a bit humorous. When the sky began to brighten, Tao Wenhai, who was in high spirits and didn't feel sleepy at all, still got up and bid farewell. He asked the king of Beiliang to allow Tao Tanxiang to stroll around the Tao residence with him. Su Fengnian smiled and nodded in agreement. The two of them strolled toward the Tao library. From beginning to end, the two of them were shoulder to shoulder apart and didn't give off the feeling of being neither close nor distant. Su Fengnian said apologetically, "Miss Tao, you've worked hard." She shook her head and said with a smile, "It's not hard at all. It's just that grandfather might be a bit disappointed, but I'm not disappointed. I'm very content." Su Fengnian smiled knowingly and didn't mince his words. "You don't have to worry about not being able to find a husband. Nowadays, there are a lot of handsome scholars who want to become officials, and there are also many who are talented and learned." Tao Tanxiang made a sound of acknowledgement and walked closer to the building. She said, "People of the world value additions and complete order when it comes to collecting books. For example, there is a saying that 1 page is worth 100 taels of silver and a set is worth 1,000 taels of gold. However, our library doesn't care about this. Grandfather feels that nothing is as important as the words of the sages in the books. Rather than spending 1,000 taels of silver to buy a set, it's better to buy 100 sets of normal books. Therefore, the number of books in this library is no less than those in the Central Plains. Furthermore, if scholars come to borrow books to read, they will be able to do so without obstruction." Su Fengnian nodded and said, "I've heard that your Tao family is also fully responsible for the food and lodging of the scholars who come to study. That's very rare. The scholars of Beiliang don't travel as much as the Central Plains, but because of your Tao family, Yanji County doesn't lose to Jiangnan." Tao Tanxiang said gently, "My father once said that a prosperous family is like a person with plump skin. However, if the yang energy is too strong and isn't adjusted, there will be a day when the internal organs will be damaged. Thus, our Tao family's year after year of disaster relief, borrowing books, and kindness to our neighbors are all necessary treatments. We can't wait until the illness is beyond cure to mend the pen after the sheep is lost." Su Fengnian joked, "Just based on these words, your father is more than qualified to be a governor." Su Fengnian walked toward the door of the Tao manor. As he crossed the threshold, he said to Tao Tanxiang, "You should go back first. It's very hurtful for a woman to stay up late. I still have to go to the memorial arch to wait for someone." She narrowed her eyes and smiled brilliantly. She said mischievously, "It's fine. I really want to know who in the world can make the king of Beiliang wait." Su Fengnian dismissed it with a smile. The two of them stood under a memorial arch. After waiting for a long time, a carriage and a group of more than 100 white horses finally appeared at the end of their vision. Tao Tanxiang turned her head and happened to see him smile. She saw him quickly walk over to greet them. She did not follow. She stood where she was and watched his figure gradually disappear into the distance. The carriage and the group of riders neatly stopped. Tao Tanxiang saw a young woman whose face could not be seen clearly walk down from the carriage. Su Fengnian looked at the woman who had come all the way from the prince's mansion in Liang province. He asked gently, "Are you cold?" She shook her head. One of the riders who had come with the white horse righteous attendant did not dismount from his horse. He only exchanged glances with Su Fengnian and nodded. Then, he turned his horse around and rode away. This rider did not carry a saber or a crossbow. He only carried a heavy iron spear. But with this rider and spear, the entire Yuzhou would not fall into chaos. Su Fengnian asked for a war horse from the white horse righteous attendant. He first carried her onto the horse. Then, he mounted the horse himself. The two of them rode together. Su Fengnian said apologetically, "I promised you before that I would see the scenery of Beiliang." She leaned into his warm embrace and did not say anything. Su Fengnian squeezed the horse's belly and galloped along the path the white horse righteous attendant had taken. Other than the two of them and the horse, there was no one else around. Her face glowing, she raised her hands to her mouth and said with a childish smile, "Su Fengnian takes Lu Chengyan and the white horse righteous attendant to Beiliang." The white horse righteous attendant to Beiliang. 1,000 li swift wind. Chapter 1335. When Beimang's army was pressing on the border on 3 fronts, the Liang imperial court had not learned of this matter. Beiliang would not pass this military intelligence to the capital. Even if the capital heard of this, they would probably only breathe a sigh of relief. Barbarians killing barbarians, dogs biting dogs, it had nothing to do with them. It would be best if both sides were heavily injured. It would be a great thing to drive away bad luck for the Liang imperial court. On the straight official road outside the south gate of the capital, there were 4 people who didn't have passports. A couple with a child. The child was riding on the neck of the man with the sword. It was clear that they were a family of 3. Then there was an extra white-clothed person beside them. This white-clothed person gave people a vague feeling. In terms of appearance, he was not outstanding. He did not have the beauty of a woman, nor was he as handsome as a man. The people nearby did not dare to look at this person. They only glanced at him. But when they thought about it, he should have left some impression. But they did not have the courage to look again. As for the inconspicuous family of 3, they were naturally ignored. The man holding his child's legs looked at the city walls of Great Peace City and sighed. In the world, this is probably the only city that can make things difficult for me. I want to go in, but I'm afraid of causing trouble. The 3 of us do not have proper identities in Liang, and we can't really force our way in. It's also not appropriate to sneak in at night. At the time, there was a person surnamed Xier in the city. He was not my match in fighting, but it was easy for him to find me. I wanted to take my wife and daughter into play, not to go in and kill everyone. For this kind of thing, it would be better if I was 20 years younger. The white-clothed person laughed coldly. Didn't Hong Shixiang do it? The man said helplessly. Aren't you comparing me to Ancestor Lu? The white-clothed person said calmly. In terms of those unclear identities, would you lose? Even in terms of martial talent in this life, you would not lose. In the end, you fell to a state worse than Tuoba Bodhisattva. The man had a smug look on his face as if he had nothing to say to her. His wife quickly smoothed things over and said with a smile, My husband was born lazy. Actually, isn't it pretty good? He doesn't have to fight with others for no reason. It's also peaceful. The man nodded in agreement. That's right. The child rested her chin on her father's head and nodded along with him. Although she didn't understand anything, she still cheered, That's right, that's right. The white-robed person gazed at Great Peace City. Over the past 800 years, from the Great Qin dynasty to Liang, apart from the most majestic city in the world in front of her, she had been to almost every capital city. The child suddenly said, Father, didn't Mother say before that there was a guy who liked to wear green clothes who often went to the city? Why do you have a headache? Father, it doesn't matter if you can't defeat my future master, but you can at least fight for the 2nd or 3rd place in the world, right? The man rubbed his chin and said seriously, That's true. The woman pinched him hard on the waist. Just as the man was about to speak, he found that the person he had been traveling with had turned and left. He really was as lazy as his wife had said. He couldn't be bothered to use his brain to think of the reason, but he couldn't help but complain. Aren't your identities as the great demon Luo Yang a mess? Do you have the right to criticize me? The white-robed person was Luo Yang. He was the person who had run from Beimang to Liang and found his wife. Then because his wife said that swordsmen were the most natural, he found a sword and pretended to be a swordsman. He had a precious daughter and met Luo Yang and Tuoba Bodhisattva at the foot of Mount Hui. If this was in Beimang, his fame would be great. Beimang had 5 large sections. The sect he belonged to was one of them, and he was the only member of the sect. The only one in the world. One person, one sect. Of course, he knew that he was very talented in martial arts, but he had never pursued anything like becoming the first in the world. It was like his wife wasn't that beautiful, but he fell in love with her at first sight. There were always some things in the world that didn't have a reason. His only pursuit was to be unrestrained. When he was young, he had his own freedom. After he met his wife and had a child, he had the freedom of a family of 3. As for what freedom was, he didn't want to think about it. Looking at the majestic city, he could clearly feel the flow of fate. Presumably, after the new emperor of Liang ascended the throne, because Han Shangxian, Master Lu Hao, and the one surnamed Xie were all dead, he was afraid that he would be beheaded after wearing the dragon robe and sitting on the dragon throne for a few days. Therefore, he set up layers upon layers of murky traps. This was reasonable. With the Liang dynasty's thriving national strength, they wouldn't be completely helpless against a single top martial artist. His daughter suddenly whispered, "Father, I want to eat leek pancakes." The man stilled and then turned with a grin to look at his daughter-in-law, who was not as important as him. The woman stepped on his foot. "Idiot! What are you practicing martial arts for? Can't your daughter eat a pancake?" She quickly added, "It's not like we don't pay." The man who had received the imperial decree nodded and smiled. "All right." He freed a hand to hold his wife and said softly, "Daughter, hold tight." In an instant, all the first-grade experts in Great Peace City, both on the surface and under the surface, felt a great presence. The Northern Sex Dragon Rising Chi Refinement warriors were panicking like headless flies. The man raised a smiling face. What was freedom? At least at this time he knew the answer. Freedom. That was when his daughter said she wanted to eat pancakes. Even if the entire Great Peace City wanted to stop her, they could not stop him. Huyen Grand Monastery. There was a flash of light on the road like a rainbow falling into Great Peace City. Great Peace City did have the saying of late autumn cabbage and spring leeks. These two things, whether it was the officials, the nobles, or the common people, every family could afford to eat them and liked to eat them. The people of Jing liked to use leeks to eat spring. It was the best season. Eating a bite of the spicy and fresh green leeks could expel the foul energy that had accumulated in the organs all winter out of the stomach. In the Zhao family manor, which was the largest building in the capital, the burps of many officials emitted the smell of leeks, not to mention the farts that came out from under the buttocks of some officials. It really made people frown, but soon they smiled. On Zhao Jiaowing's side, there was the Hanlin Academy, which had always been noble and aloof. There were also the two big yamens of the two provinces under the Hall of Governmental Affairs, which used to be deserted but now slightly lively. However, the most boisterous ones were the yamens of the 6 ministries of Shangshu Province. The Ministry of War had always been the most important place among the 6 ministries of external court. Even after the Prime Minister Yin Mao-chun replaced Zhao Yuling as the Minister of Personnel Affairs, he could not change the situation. Unlike the other 5 great generals, who had their fates changed every few years, the Ministry of War had only had 3 people who had been in that position since the first year of Yonghui to the second year of Xiongfu. They were the great pillar state Gu Jiantang, the king of Shu Chen Jibao, and the current Tongshi sword deity Lu Baijie. The latter two had only been in that position for less than 2 years. Without a doubt, the Ministry of War had always been the feng shui treasure land that the new Jinshe wanted to have the most. So much so that last year, Gao Tingshu, who had been the second place of the imperial exam, admitted that he would rather be the head of the Department of Martial Selection and Purging Officials than go to the Ministry of Rights to be the most easily promoted minister-counselor of the Department of Rights. One had to know that the Minister of Rights, Bai Gua, was present in the main hall at the time. Minister Bai was so angry that he laughed and kicked the other minister, Lu Baijie. Rumor had it that Bai Gua was transferred to the Minister of Revenue. One day, he met the new second place in the imperial court. The Minister of Rights teased him. "Fortunately, I didn't take up a post in the Ministry of Appointments. Otherwise, you would be sitting on the cold bench in the Ministry of War for 10 or 20 years. Today, the unusually busy Ministry of War had a somewhat unexpected guest. Everyone in the Ministry of War, whether they were walking outside or sitting inside, either stopped and saluted when they saw him or stood up solemnly. Everyone looked excited. It was not much different from meeting the Emperor alone. It was very simple. It was because this person was Gu Jiantang, the youngest warrior of the 4 great generals of the spring and autumn period, the former master of the Ministry of War, Gu Lu. As a general, Su Xiao, who was also a famous general of the spring and autumn period, had already died of old age. Gu Jiantang could not even be considered old. As an official, Zhang Lu, who had been in conflict with Gu Lu for more than 10 years, had already collapsed. Zhang Julu had died a miserable death. Gu Jiantang, on the other hand, was the only super first-rank pillar of the Liang imperial court. He held the power of 300,000 soldiers and horses at the northern border. Gu Jiantang walked alone into the large room of the old Zhang Lu. Without needing him to say anything, a large group of arrogant officials in the 6 ministries stood up and saluted, then quickly sat down and continued with their work. This was the cold and hard temperament that Gu Jiantang had left for the Ministry of War. You can be arrogant and despotic in your conduct, but you must be swift and decisive in your work. You must not be sloppy. Unlike the other 5 ministers and assistant ministers who each had their own room, the 3 main and assistant ministers of the Ministry of War all worked in the same room. The minister's desk was placed at the far left of the room, while the left and right assistant minister's desks were placed at the far right. At present, of the 2 assistant ministers of the Ministry of War, the general of Piao Yi Lu Shangxiang was not in the capital as the general of the southern expedition. The newly appointed assistant minister, general of Dragon Xiang, Su Gong, was patrolling the border in accordance with the new etiquette of Liang. Thus, only the minister, Lu Baijie, was left in the room. After seeing Gu Jiantang, he did not deliberately put on airs. Instead, he stood up like his subordinates and stood up to greet the old minister. He even waited for the others to return to their seats before standing up. This was not only because Lu Baijie's official patch with a second-rank lion embroidered on his chest was slightly inferior to Gu Jiantang's first-rank qilin. It was also because Lu Baijie had undisguised respect for the senior of the Ministry of War, Gu Jiantang. Lu Baijie walked around the table to Gu Jiantang's side and said with a smile, "General, sit down and have a cup of tea?"